There is a stretch of ocean so brutal, so indifferent to human life, that even the men who sailed it said the sea itself felt like an enemy before the enemy ever arrived. North of the Arctic Circle, where the sun refuses to set in summer and the water temperature hovers just above the threshold that kills a man in minutes, 35 merchant ships assembled in the summer of 1942. They were loaded with more than 400 tanks, over 200 aircraft, 3,000 vehicles, and enough ammunition and supplies to tip the balance of the bloodiest land war in recorded history. Their destination was the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk, more than 1,400 nautical miles away across water that would try to kill them whether the Germans did or not. They were Convoy PQ-17. Most of them never made it. 24 of those 35 ships were sunk. 153 merchant seamen died. And the worst part, the detail that would haunt naval history for generations, was that the catastrophe did not happen because the Germans outfought them. It happened because of a single order issued from a desk in London by a man who had never fired a gun in anger, but whose 7 words sent those crews to their fates. The order read, "Convoy is to scatter." What you are about to hear over the next several hours is the full story. It begins long before those ships left Iceland. It begins with a desperate alliance forged between nations that did not entirely trust each other, fighting an enemy that had already consumed most of Europe. It stretches across the frozen Barents Sea, through intelligence failures and command panic, through acts of extraordinary courage in lifeboats that had no right to survive, and through the long, cold silence afterward when governments argued over blame, while the families of the dead waited for news that would never come the way they hoped. Stay with us. Settle in. This is a story that deserves to be told slowly and told right. If you find yourself returning to this channel for long-form history that honors the people who lived these events, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below about which aspect of this story moves you most. Now let us begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. The World on Fire. The alliance that built the Arctic Run. The summer of 1941 changed the shape of the war in ways that no one, not in London, not in Washington, and certainly not in Moscow, had fully anticipated. On the 22nd of June that year, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in the history of warfare, crashing 3 million soldiers across the Soviet border on a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. Whole air forces had been wiped out on the ground before their pilots could even climb into their cockpits. The scale of the catastrophe facing the Soviet Union was almost impossible to comprehend from the outside, and nearly unlivable from within. Joseph Stalin, who had convinced himself that the Nazi-Soviet pact would hold, now faced the destruction of his country. Britain's response was almost immediate, not because Winston Churchill had any great love for the Soviet system, which he had spent years opposing, but because Churchill understood something with cold clarity. If the Soviet Union fell, the full weight of German military power would pivot westward, and Britain, already stretched thin after 2 years of war, would face a threat it could not survive alone. Within weeks of Barbarossa, Britain and the Soviet Union signed a mutual assistance agreement. Before the end of September 1941, British ships had already dispatched 450 aircraft, 22,000 long tons of rubber, and 3 million pairs of boots towards Soviet ports. This was not generosity in the romantic sense. This was survival arithmetic. The United States, still officially neutral but increasingly entwined in the Allied cause through President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program, was brought into the equation almost immediately. In September of 1941, British and American representatives traveled to Moscow to assess Soviet needs on the ground. What they found was sobering. 2 of the Soviet Union's largest aircraft factories had been physically dismantled and were being transported eastward, out of range of German bombers, to the Ural Mountains. In the meantime, Soviet aircraft production had collapsed from 80 to 30 planes per day. The Red Army needed tanks, planes, vehicles, food, raw materials, and wire, not eventually, not when it was convenient, but now, and in quantities that would require a sustained, organized, and enormously dangerous supply chain operating through the worst waters in the world. The solution, such as it was the Arctic convoy route. Ships would assemble in Iceland or Scotland, form up into convoy columns, and sail northeast past the coast of Norway, German-occupied Norway, bristling with U-boats, long-range reconnaissance aircraft, and surface warships before turning south and east through the Barents Sea toward the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The route was between 1,400 and 2,000 nautical miles each way. The voyage could take 3 weeks. The waters along the route were among the most violent on the planet, funneled into a narrow corridor between the advancing Arctic ice pack and the German bases on the Norwegian coast. There was no wide, comfortable sea room to maneuver. The corridor narrowed with each passing month of summer as the ice receded northward, creating more open water, yes, but also more exposure to the German forces that were watching from the shore. The first convoy sailed in September of 1941. It arrived, others followed. By the winter of 1941-42, a rhythm had been established, imperfect, costly, and terrifying, but functional. The convoys were coded by direction. PQ for outbound, bound for the Soviet Union. QP for homebound, returning to Britain. The PQ series began quietly enough, with small groups of ships running in the relative shelter of winter darkness. But Winston Churchill had made a promise to Stalin a convoy every 10 days, 1,200 tanks a month from July of 1942 onward, and keeping that promise would require sending larger and larger convoys through waters that were growing more dangerous, not less, as German forces in Norway were systematically reinforced and retrained for anti-shipping operations. By the end of 1941, the early convoys had already demonstrated their strategic value in terms that went beyond the cargoes they carried. 187 Matilda tanks and 249 Valentine tanks, delivered by the winter convoys, made up roughly a quarter of the medium-heavy armor defending Moscow during the German drive. On the Soviet capital, 16% of the fighters over Moscow in December of that year were Hawker Hurricanes that had arrived by sea from Britain. These were not symbolic gestures. These were weapons that went directly from Allied hulls into the hands of Soviet soldiers on the front line, often within days of unloading. The Arctic route was dangerous, uncertain, and ferociously expensive in ships and men, but it was working, and both sides knew it. The Germans, watching from their Norwegian airfields and submarine pens, made a decision. This supply line had to be broken. The year 1942 brought escalation on both sides of this equation. The Allies began planning larger, more heavily escorted convoys. The Germans began building the machinery to destroy them. In Norway, the Luftwaffe's Air Fleet 5, based at Kirkenes, Banak, and Bardufoss, was reinforced and reorganized specifically for anti-shipping operations. By the summer of 1942, Air Fleet 5 had 264 aircraft available, including 103 Junkers, Ju-88 bombers, 42 Heinkel, He-111 torpedo bombers, 30 Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, and dozens of long-range reconnaissance aircraft and flying boats. These crews trained on a specific tactic called the Golden Comb, a coordinated wave attack that was designed to overwhelm a convoy's anti-aircraft defenses by presenting too many targets simultaneously for any single gun crew to engage effectively. Meanwhile, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, stationed its most powerful surface ships in Norwegian fjords, just hours of steaming from the convoy route. The German surface fleet in Norway in the summer of 1942 was a force built not for battle but for threat. The battleship Tirpitz, 42,000 tons, 9 15-inch guns, the most powerful warship Germany ever launched, sat in a Norwegian fjord like a sword held at her throat. She rarely moved. She did not need to. Her very presence tied down Allied capital ships that could not be risked elsewhere as long as Tirpitz remained alive and potentially mobile. Alongside her were the heavy cruiser Hipper, the pocket battleship Lutzow, the heavy cruiser Scheer, and a screen of destroyers. The Germans had organized these vessels into two battle groups, Force 1, based at Trondheim, and Force 2, further north rehearsing and planning an operation they had codenamed Russell Sprung, Knight's Move. The plan was elegant and brutal. When the next large Allied convoy sailed within range, these ships would emerge from their fjords and destroy it. What the Germans understood, and what some officers in the British Admiralty had begun to fear with mounting anxiety, was that the Arctic route had a fundamental vulnerability in summer that did not exist in winter. In winter, the polar darkness could hide a convoy from aerial reconnaissance. In summer, under the midnight sun, there was no darkness, not for days, not for weeks. From late May through mid-July in those latitudes, the sun simply does not set. It circles the horizon, flooding the sea with flat, grey-white light 24 hours a day. Under that light, a convoy could be spotted from the air, tracked from the air, and attacked from the air with no natural cover whatsoever. The Germans could see everything. And in the summer of 1942, they were about to prove exactly what that meant for 35 ships and the men aboard them. The men who sailed those ships were not, for the most part, naval officers. The merchant crews were civilian sailors, men who had spent their working lives carrying grain, oil, coal, and timber across peacetime seas and now found themselves handling exactly the same cargoes, wearing the same worn-out oilskins, but in a world that had become fundamentally and permanently dangerous. They received no combat pay, no military rank, and in the early years of the war, no standardized survivor's benefit if their ship went down. They volunteered anyway, or they stayed because it was what they knew, or they stayed because someone had to. Alongside them sailed the men of the Royal Navy and the United States Navy Armed Guard gunners stationed aboard merchant ships to man the defensive armament that had been bolted onto hulls never designed to carry it. These men would live and fight, and in many cases die alongside their merchant counterparts, sharing the same frostbitten watches, the same anxiety at the sound of an aircraft engine, and the same silence of the open sea after a ship alongside them ceased to exist. This is their world. This is the stage. Understand the physical, political, and human reality of what was about to unfold, and then ask yourself, when the orders came from London in the small hours of the 4th of July, 1942, whether any single man on any of those 35 ships could have done anything differently. The answer, as you will discover, is complicated, and it belongs in the silences between the official records. Chapter 2. The Route to Ruin Geography, Ice, and the Corridors of Death. There is no kind way to describe the Arctic Ocean in summer to someone who has never stood watch on a ship in those waters. Start with the cold, not the bracing cold of a winter morning in a northern city, but a damp, penetrating cold that does not stop at your clothes and reaches into your muscles and your joints with the patient certainty of something that has all the time in the world. At sea in the Barents Sea region, the water temperature rarely rises above 4 degrees Celsius even in midsummer. A man who falls overboard without a life jacket will lose consciousness within 15 minutes. A man with a life jacket will last perhaps 30 minutes before his heart gives out. In the winter months, the water is even colder, and the spraying of waves over the ship's superstructure freezes almost on contact, building up weight that must be physically chipped away around the clock to prevent the vessel from becoming top-heavy and capsizing. The crews of the Arctic convoys did not just fight the Germans. They fought the sea every single hour of every single watch for the entire voyage. The geography of the route enforced its own particular cruelty. Between Greenland to the west and Norway to the east, there is roughly 890 miles of open ocean. But the convoy route did not enjoy the luxury of that entire width. To the north, the Arctic ice pack advanced and retreated with the seasons, forcing convoys into a corridor that could be as little as a few hundred miles wide at certain times of year. In winter, when the ice came furthest south, convoys were pushed closer to the Norwegian coast and thus closer to the German air bases and patrol craft. In summer, when the ice retreated northward towards Svalbard, there was more sea room, but as already noted, the endless daylight neutralized whatever comfort more open water might have offered. The Germans could see the ships could not hide. The specific geography of the route in the summer of 1942 took the convoy northeast from Iceland through the Denmark Strait, the channel between Iceland and Greenland, then east and northeast, passing north of the island of Jan Mayen, north of Bear Island, and into the open Barents Sea, before turning southeast toward Arkhangelsk. This northern arc, pushed further north than earlier convoys by the relatively good ice conditions that summer, added distance and time to the voyage. But it also placed the ships in waters where the ice could become a navigational hazard in its own right, as the first days of PQ-17's voyage would demonstrate when part of the convoy ran directly into drifting pack ice. In thick fog in the Denmark Strait, damaging two merchant ships and forcing them to turn back. The choke point, the place where the corridor became unavoidably narrow and dangerous, was the area around Bear Island, a desolate Norwegian territory sitting roughly midway between the northern tip of Norway and the Svalbard archipelago. Bear Island was not much to look at, a flat, wind-scoured rock about 17 miles long and 11 miles wide, with no permanent civilian population and no shelter. But on a chart, it was significant. The channel between Bear Island and the ice to the north was the gateway to the Barents Sea and the German air forces at Banak, barely 300 miles away on the Norwegian mainland, were designed precisely to interdict anything that passed through that gate. North of Bear Island, a convoy was at maximum range from German air bases and relatively safe. East of Bear Island, moving into the Barents Sea toward Arkhangelsk, the convoy moved back within range of shore-based aircraft and into the killing ground. The Barents Sea itself was a different kind of hostile. Wide and shallow in places, it could generate seas that rose quickly and broke in unpredictable patterns. The weather changed with extraordinary speed. A calm morning could become a violent grey chaos by afternoon, with wind-driven snow reducing visibility to near zero and waves that wrenched at deck cargo and snapped lashings that had seemed perfectly secure. The ships in a convoy had to maintain station regardless of weather, maintaining the columns and rows that were their only real protection against submarine attack, since a compact formation made it very difficult for a U-boat to get into a firing position without coming within range of the escorts. Breaking formation, falling behind, losing sight of the Commodore's ship, these were the things that got a merchant vessel killed, even before the enemy was involved. Discipline at sea under those conditions was not a matter of regulations, it was survival. The Soviet ports at the end of this route presented their own complications. Murmansk, on the Kola Inlet, was closer the first reachable port after rounding the North Cape, but by the summer of 1942, German aircraft had bombed it so severely that much of the city was rubble and the port facilities were severely degraded. Arkhangelsk, further south in the White Sea, was deeper and more protected, and it became the primary destination for PQ-17. Getting to Arkhangelsk from Bear Island added another several hundred miles of exposed steaming across the Barents Sea, with Soviet air cover not reliably available until the convoy was well within range of shore. The Soviet Navy would send destroyers and minesweepers to meet the convoy and provide final escort, but the stretch between the escort's departure point and the Soviet rendezvous was a gap, and in that gap, ships died. One element of the Arctic environment that deserves particular attention because it becomes directly relevant to the tragedy of PQ-17 is the effect of the ocean's layered temperature structure on underwater. Sound, the Barents Sea, where cold Arctic water meets the warmer, saltier inflow of the North Atlantic Drift, creates thermal layers at varying depths. Sound behaves strangely in layered water. A submarine could disappear into a temperature boundary and become almost invisible to ASDIC, the British underwater sound detection system that escort vessels relied upon to locate U-boats. German submarine commanders who knew their local waters, who had spent time learning the thermal contours of specific areas, could exploit these layers to evade detection and approach a convoy in near silence. The men on the escort destroyers running their ASDIC sweeps knew this. It was one more thing to be afraid of the knowledge that the instruments you trusted might be lying to you. Weather as both adversary and ally shaped almost every significant decision in Arctic convoy operations. Heavy fog and low cloud could hide a convoy from Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, buying hours of safety, but the same fog and low cloud could also obscure a periscope until a torpedo was already in the water. Heavy sea conditions could make anti-aircraft gunnery almost impossible, as gun crews on wet, heaving decks tried to track fast-moving aircraft through gun sights that were shaking with the ship's motion. A calm, sunny day, beautiful by any ordinary measure, was the most dangerous kind of weather for a convoy, because it meant the Luftwaffe flying boats circling overhead at high altitude could see every ship in perfect detail and radio their positions to the bomber and torpedo squadrons waiting on the Norwegian airfields. The men of the Arctic convoys learned to dread clear blue skies in a way that no weather forecast had ever taught them. The human geography of the route mattered too. Along the coast of Norway, whose people were living under German occupation, there were observation posts and agents who could report convoy sightings. In the waters between Norway and Svalbard, German surface vessels on patrol could be encountered. At the far end of the route, the landscape shifted from open ocean to the flat, marshy shores of northern Russia, navigated with the help of Soviet pilots who came aboard to guide ships through shallow coastal channels unfamiliar to Western navigators. From Iceland to Arkhangelsk, virtually every mile of the route had some mechanism by which a convoy could be found, followed, and attacked. Against this, the Allied convoys had their escorts, their anti-aircraft guns, their ASDIC, their radio discipline, and their formation sailing. And for most of the journey of PQ-17, these things held. The convoy covered more than half its route before the order came that stripped it of everything that kept it alive. Chapter 3. The ships and the men, 35 hulls, and a world of weight. On the 27th of June, 1942, at the deep water anchorage of Hvalfjörður in Iceland, a congregation of ships that could only have been assembled by a world at war began to form itself into a convoy. The harbour, a long fjord of dark water cutting between the black lava hills of southwestern Iceland, was not a comfortable anchorage. The holding ground was soft in places, the currents unpredictable, and the proximity of so many heavily laden vessels carrying explosives, aviation fuel, and ammunition in close quarters was a fact that the men aboard them preferred not to think about too directly. But Hvalfjörður was what they had, and on that summer morning, the sun already high, even at an hour most people would call early, the 35 merchant ships and their escort vessels were making ready to sail. The merchant fleet that made up the substance of PQ-17 was a reflection of the improvised, multinational character of the Allied war effort. There were American ships, Liberty ships, built in yards that had been working around the clock to produce standardized cargo vessels fast enough to replace the ones being sunk in the Atlantic. There were British ships. There were vessels flying the flags of Panama, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. Roughly a third of the merchant ships were American freighters whose crews had been designated US. Navy armed guard, with Navy gunners stationed at the newly installed defensive armament, 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, larger caliber deck guns, and whatever else could be bolted to a hull that had been designed for peacetime cargo service. The total value of the cargo they carried has been estimated at more than $500 million, an almost incomprehensible figure in the values of 1942, representing not just money, but the labor and resources of American and British factories already strained by 2 or more years of war production. The cargo itself, stacked in holds and lashed to decks, told the story of a land war in existential crisis. 430 tanks, American Sherman and British Valentine and Matilda models, some still in their factory green, some stenciled with Soviet supply codes, sat chained to the decks of flatbeds and nestled in holds alongside 3,350 vehicles, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, artillery tractors, 210 aircraft-filled crates that took up entire sections of hold space. Alongside the weapons of direct combat, there were commodities no army can fight without: food in vast quantities, medical supplies, boots by the hundreds of thousands of pairs, aluminium, copper wire, machine tools, telephone equipment, and tens of thousands of tons of general cargo that covered every category of material need the Soviet war machine might have. This was not a shipping exercise. Every hull in that convoy was a lifeline, and the men who sailed those hulls knew it, even if they were not in the habit of expressing it in those terms. The close escort for PQ-17, under the command of Commander Jack Broom, was the first escort group, a force made up of 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, and 2 anti-aircraft auxiliary ships, HMS Palomares and HMS Pozarica. The destroyers Keppel, Fury, Leamington, Ledbury, Offa, and Wilton were the teeth of the escort, fast enough to chase a surfaced U-boat and well armed enough to suppress air attack in the short range. The corvettes and minesweepers provided additional anti-submarine cover, their ASDIC equipment sweeping the water around the convoy's perimeter. The armed trawlers, crewed largely by peacetime fishermen with Arctic experience, brought a different kind of knowledge to the convoy. These men knew this sea not from charts but from years of working it, and their steadiness in conditions that would have unnerved a less experienced crew was a quiet asset. Beyond the close escort, Convoy PQ-17 enjoyed a covering force of extraordinary strength by the standards of any previous Arctic convoy. Rear Admiral Louis Hamilton commanded the 1st Cruiser Squadron, consisting of the British cruisers HMS London and HMS Norfolk, and the American cruisers USS Wichita and USS Tuscaloosa, escorted by 4 destroyers. These ships were the convoy's protection against German surface vessels powerful enough to engage cruisers, though not battleships. Sitting further west, the distant cover included the heavy covering force under Admiral John Tovey, the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious, the battleship HMS Duke of York, the American battleship USS Washington, the cruisers HMS Cumberland and HMS Nigeria, and 9 destroyers. This force, intended to engage Tirpitz should she actually emerge, never came within combat range of the convoy. It was held back deliberately as a fleet-in-being counter to the German surface threat. The convoy commodore, the officer aboard one of the merchant ships responsible for the formation, speed, and navigation of the merchant fleet itself, was John Dowding, a retired naval officer re-employed for the war, sailing in the merchant vessel River Afton with his signals party and codebooks. The Commodore's role was in some ways the most demanding and least acknowledged in the entire convoy structure. He had no power over the escort warships, who answered to their own commanders. He could not force merchant captains to obey him. He could signal, advise, plead, and lead by example. He sailed aboard a civilian ship with no more armor than a merchant hull provided, in the most visible position in the convoy column. River Afton would be sunk on the 5th of July. Dowding survived. 3 rescue ships sailed with the convoy Rathlin, Zamalek, and Zafaran. These were small vessels, purpose-fitted with nets, scramble ladders, medical equipment, and increased accommodation, designed to loiter in the convoy's wake and pull survivors from the water. The men of the rescue ships occupied a peculiar moral position in convoy operations. Their job required them to stop, to attract attention, to remain stationary in water where submarines might still be operating. They were the most generous and most exposed ships in any convoy, and the men who served on them did so with a clear understanding of what that meant. Rathlin, Zamalek, and Zafaran would have ample, terrible use for their equipment before the voyage was over. Also sailing as part of the convoy's service element was the fleet oiler, RFA Aldersdale, whose function was to refuel the escort destroyers at sea critical on a voyage of this length, because the destroyer's fuel endurance was not sufficient to complete the round trip without replenishment. The original oiler assigned for this purpose, RFA Grey Ranger, had been damaged in ice in the Denmark Strait in the early days of the voyage, and her speed reduced. Aldersdale was substituted. An oiler in a convoy is an asset of particular fragility, slow, deep-laden, unable to maneuver quickly, carrying exactly the kind of cargo that turns a hit into a catastrophe. Every man on every ship in the convoy understood what a burning oiler would look like in those waters, and no one who has read accounts of the aftermath of PQ-17 can mistake what those words meant in practice. Finally, 2 submarines accompanied the convoy for the early stages of the voyage. P-614 and P-615, providing additional underwater patrol capability. Their contribution to the convoy's safety was ultimately limited. The submarine environment in those Arctic waters, with its unpredictable thermal layers and challenging acoustic conditions, made underwater navigation and attack geometry difficult for any vessel. But they were present, and their presence was part of the layered defensive system that PQ-17 relied upon. For a few more days, that system would hold. And then it would collapse, not from the sea bottom up, as a torpedo might collapse it, but from the command structure down, as a signal arrived from London that undid everything in 25 words. Chapter 4. Operation Knight's Move, the German Trap is Set. The Germans had been watching. That simple fact runs like a cold current beneath every decision made by both sides in the lead-up to the 4th of July, 1942. They had been watching not merely with aircraft and patrol vessels, though they had plenty of both, but with something more precise and more insidious. They had been reading Allied signals. The German Navy's intelligence service, the Beobachtungsdienst known as B-Dienst, had broken Naval Cipher Number 3, the code used for communications between the British Admiralty and convoys and their escorts, as early as February of 1942. By March of that year, B-Dienst was reading up to 80% of the traffic passing through that cipher. The Allies did not know this. They believed their communications were secure. They were not. This signal's intelligence advantage was not the only window the Germans had into Allied intentions. By the summer of 1942, German long-range reconnaissance aircraft, the four-engine Focke-Wulf FW200 Condors, the Junkers Ju-88 variants converted for maritime patrol, and the Blohm & Voss BV-138 flying boats with their distinctive three-engine profile, had established persistent surveillance over the northern convoy routes. A BV-138 could loiter for hours at high altitude, virtually invisible, and safely beyond the range of any shipboard anti-aircraft weapon, simply watching and transmitting. When PQ-17 cleared the Denmark Strait, these aircraft found it almost immediately. The convoy was located by German forces on the 1st of July, 1942, 4 days before the scatter order. From that moment until the end, it was never lost. The specific German plan to destroy convoy PQ-17 had been in preparation for weeks. The operation was called Russelsprung, Knight's Move, a chess reference whose elegance was somewhat undermined by the contradictory instructions under which it operated. The German surface forces assembled for the operation were divided into two groups. Force 1, based at Trondheim, was centered on the battleship Tirpitz and the heavy cruiser Hipper, supported by a screen of destroyers and torpedo boats. Force 2, based further north at Narvik, consisted of the pocket battleships Lützow and Admiral Scheer and a destroyer escort. The combined firepower of these vessels was formidable enough to destroy any convoy escort then sailing in the Arctic, and almost certainly the convoy itself, in any direct engagement. The operation's strategic logic was simple. One appearance of this force, even without firing a shot, could end the Arctic convoys. But the operation had a crippling flaw built directly into its orders. Hitler, whose caution about risking his capital ships had by this point become almost a neurosis, rooted in the loss of the Bismarck the previous year, had issued standing orders that the surface fleet was not to engage unless enemy carriers could be confirmed as absent from the operational area, and not to accept any engagement that might result in damage to the major units, particularly Tirpitz. The Kriegsmarine Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Erich Raeder, had accordingly built into the Russelsprung orders a provision that the attack on the convoy could only proceed once aerial reconnaissance had confirmed that no Allied aircraft carrier was within range. This was, as events would prove, an almost impossible standard to meet. The Allied covering force included HMS Victorious, and until Victorious could be definitively located, Tirpitz could not advance. The convoy's escorts understood, at least in broad terms, that they were approaching the most dangerous part of the route. By the 3rd of July, aerial reconnaissance had confirmed that Tirpitz and Hipper were no longer visible in their anchorage at Trondheim. They had moved north to Vestfjord on the Norwegian coast, and then further north toward Altenfjord near the North Cape. This movement was alarming. Altenfjord was much closer to the convoy's route. A Tirpitz sortie from Altenfjord to the convoy's position would take only hours. The British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, which had for much of the war been able to read German Navy signals through the Enigma machine's Heimish settings, had been partly compromised in February of that year when the U-boat Enigma settings changed. Bletchley could still read surface ship signals in the Arctic, but the intelligence picture was patchy and time-delayed. What Bletchley could confirm by the evening of the 3rd of July was suggestive, but not definitive. Tirpitz appeared to have moved north. Whether she was at sea and heading for the convoy that no one in London could say with certainty, the intelligence officer most directly responsible for assessing Tirpitz's position was a lieutenant commander in the Naval Intelligence Division named Norman Denning. On the evening of the 4th of July, shortly before the scatter order was issued, Admiral Dudley Pound consulted Denning directly. Could he confirm that Tirpitz had left Altenfjord? Denning's answer was careful and conditional. He could not confirm that Tirpitz was still at anchor, but he could say that his sources would normally have provided indication if the ship had put to sea for an attack, and no such indication had been received. In other words, absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence, but the silences in the intelligence picture were, in Denning's professional judgment, somewhat reassuring. Pound did not find that reassurance sufficient. In the convoys themselves, the mood on the afternoon and evening of the 4th of July was one of controlled anxiety. The convoy had already weathered its first serious attacks. On the morning of that day, a torpedo aircraft had struck the Liberty ship SS Christopher Newport, a single hit that left her stopped and sinking, with her survivors rescued before U-457 finished the job. Later that afternoon came a more disturbing development, an attack by 25 torpedo bombers, a coordinated wave assault, using the Golden Comb technique the Luftwaffe had been practicing. USS Wainwright, one of the American destroyers in the escort, broke up the attack with aggressive maneuvering and gunfire, and the convoy's ships worked their defensive guns hard. The freighter SS William Hooper was struck and had to be abandoned. 2 ships lost in one day, but the convoy was still together, still moving east, still under escort. The escorting destroyers had performed well. The Commodore's formation held. What no one aboard those ships knew, what Rear Admiral Hamilton's cruiser squadron did not know, what Commander Broom's destroyers did not know, what any of the merchant captains did not know, was that in Altenfjord at that very moment, a debate was taking place within the German Naval Command that was, in its way, just as consequential as the debate happening in London. The Kriegsmarine had received reports imprecise, incomplete, suggesting that the Allied covering force might include an aircraft carrier at dangerous proximity. Raiders' standing orders were clear. If a carrier was present, Tirpitz would not sail. The Tirpitz battle group had indeed moved north from Trondheim to Vestfjord, then to Altenfjord, arriving there on the 3rd of July. Raeder received permission from Hitler's headquarters to move to Altenfjord and await the final decision. The final decision, attack or abort, would depend on one more reconnaissance confirmation that never came convincingly enough to satisfy the preconditions. The 2 command structures were thus engaged in a mirror image of the same problem. Each was trying to determine what the other was about to do, working from intelligence that was incomplete, uncertain, and subject to the kind of urgent pressure that military decisions demand. In London, Pound was weighing the possibility that Tirpitz was at sea and bearing down on the convoy, and asking himself whether he could afford to wait for certainty. In Altenfjord, Raeder and his fleet commanders were weighing the possibility that an Allied carrier was close enough to send torpedo bombers after Tirpitz, and asking themselves whether they could afford to risk their most valuable ship. Neither man, in the event, would do what the other most feared. But the consequences of each man's caution would be catastrophic, and it would be the men in the merchant ships, entirely outside both decision-making loops, who would pay. Chapter 5. The Order 7 words that changed everything. The evening of the 4th of July, 1942 was not a calm evening in London, though the city itself would have looked deceptively quiet to anyone observing it from the street. In the underground operational rooms where the Royal Navy's senior command processed intelligence and issued orders to ships at sea, there was the particular tension of a decision that had been building for hours and could no longer be deferred. Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord and professional head of the Royal Navy, had been reviewing the intelligence picture for Convoy PQ-17 throughout the day. The reports of Tirpitz's movement to Altenfjord, the intercepted signals suggesting German surface forces were in motion, the uncertainty about the battleship's current position, all of it pointed toward a possibility that Pound could not dismiss, that Tirpitz might be at sea, hours away from the convoy, and that the Allied cruiser force protecting the convoy's flank might be sailing directly into an engagement it could not win. Pound's dilemma was genuine and deserves to be understood in its full context before judgment is rendered. The Allied cruiser force Hamilton's 4 heavy cruisers and their destroyers was powerful against anything short of a battleship. Against Tirpitz, the cruisers were outclassed in every dimension: range, armor, and weight of shell. A battleship engages cruisers at distances at which cruiser guns cannot penetrate battleship armor, while the battleship's heavy shells can strike at several times the effective range of any defensive fire the cruisers can deliver. If Tirpitz came out and caught Hamilton's cruisers in the open, those ships would be sunk. And the order not to risk the cruisers in an unequal engagement was not Pound's alone. It reflected a rational calculation about the value of major warships at a stage of the war when British naval resources were stretched across every ocean. Losing 4 cruisers to Tirpitz would be a wound from which the Royal Navy would take many months to recover. But the convoy itself, what was to become of the convoy if the escorts withdrew? Here is where the logic of Pound's decision begins to fracture under examination. A convoy under escort, even a convoy under air attack, has a fighting chance. The massed anti-aircraft fire of a compact formation is far more effective than the fire of individual ships spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. The escort's ASDIC coverage makes submarine attack geometrically more difficult. The sheer concentration of targets makes prioritization difficult for an attacking force that is not infinite in size. A convoy scattered across the Barents Sea is not a convoy at all, it is a collection of isolated targets, each one alone, each one visible in the midnight sun, each one without the protection that formation provides. Pound knew this. Every naval officer in his position knew this. The decision to scatter was not ignorance. It was a bet that Tirpitz was real and immediate, and that scattering offered the individual ships a better chance than staying together against a battleship's guns. At 21:11 on the evening of the 4th of July, the first signal was sent from the Admiralty to Rear Admiral Hamilton's cruiser squadron. Cruiser force withdraw to the westward at high speed. 12 minutes later, at 21:23, came a second signal marked immediate. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. 13 minutes after that, at 21:36, came the third and final signal. This one marked most immediate. Convoy is to scatter. 3 signals in 25 minutes. Each one progressively more urgent, more final, more irrevocable. Commander Broome, reading these signals aboard his destroyer, and knowing that his ships would now be ordered to withdraw and join the cruiser force, later described his reaction with the kind of bleak directness that military memoirs sometimes allow. It was, he said, the worst moment of his professional life. The mechanics of the scattering were orderly, which somehow makes them worse to contemplate. The convoy commodore passed the order to the merchant ships. The formation, which had been held together through fog and ice damage and torpedo attacks and days of anxiety, broke apart. Ships turned in different directions, increasing speed where their engines allowed, each captain now responsible for his own navigation, his own survival, his own crew. The destroyers, the fast, armed ships that had been the convoy's first line of defense, turned west and opened distance from the merchant fleet at speed. The larger cruisers followed. Within an hour, the merchant ships and their small remaining escort of corvettes, minesweepers, and armed trawlers were alone in the Barents Sea, under the relentless summer sun, heading in approximately the right direction with no coherent protection. Tirpitz was not at sea. This is the fact that history records with the particular cruelty that only hindsight allows. The battle group had moved to Altenfjord, yes. It had assembled, fueled, and made preparations to sortie. On the 5th of July, the day after the scatter order, Tirpitz and her consorts actually left Altenfjord and moved into open water. Then, within hours, the operation was cancelled and the ships returned to port. The concerns about Allied carrier aircraft, the inability to confirm that Victorious was at a safe distance, and the decision by OKW that the risk to the capital ships was unacceptable had combined to abort Russell Sprung before a single German gun was fired. The convoy had been scattered to escape a battleship that was already turning back before the order to scatter was issued. What followed in the hours after 21:36 on the 4th of July was not immediately apparent to anyone except the men in the merchant ships, who could already feel it happening. The coded signals that began arriving on merchant navy wavelengths received by the receding destroyers, logged, and then lost behind the curve of the horizon described what the scattering had done to those ships' chances. And being bombed by a large number of planes, on fire in the ice, abandoning ship, 6 U-boats approaching on the surface. These were not dramatizations. These were the factual, naval standard distress transmissions of crews who were burning and sinking in water that would kill the survivors who made it into the lifeboats if rescue did not arrive within a specific, calculable number of minutes. The U-boat commanders who had been shadowing the convoy were presented, in the aftermath of the scatter order, with a situation they had not dared hope for. Instead of a compact formation of 30-odd ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and escorted by destroyers whose ASDIC could find a submerged submarine at several hundred yards, they now had dozens of individual ships spread across hundreds of miles of open ocean, each one making independently for Arkhangelsk, each one visible from the air in the perpetual summer daylight, each one alone. The waiting was over. The hunting had begun. The Wolfpack Eisstiefel Ice Devil, which had been assembled and positioned in advance, began to move. Pound, it is worth noting, was not a well man at the time of these decisions. He was suffering from a brain tumour, a diagnosis not yet confirmed, but whose effects, including fatigue and impaired concentration, colleagues had been observing with concern for some months. He died in October of 1943, the diagnosis finally established. Whether his physical condition affected his judgment on the evening of the 4th of July is something that historians have debated ever since, without resolution. What can be said with certainty is that the inquiry convened afterward assigned no blame to anyone. The orders had been issued by the First Sea Lord. Criticizing the First Sea Lord was politically unacceptable. The verdict was, in effect, "This happened, no one is responsible, let us proceed." Winston Churchill called the convoy one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war. That assessment, at least, is beyond argument. Chapter 6. The Killing Ground, 5 days across the Barents Sea. The 5th of July, 1942, began under a clear Arctic sky. The midnight sun had not dimmed, had not offered the ships scattered across the Barents Sea even the small mercy of shadow or reduced visibility. By the standards of the latitude, it was almost beautiful, the sea relatively calm, the horizon sharp and clean, the sky the particular washed-out blue of the high Arctic summer. For any ship still afloat on that sea, that beauty was a form of menace. Under that sky, every hull was visible for miles. Every ship's smoke trail pointed upward into clear air, where German reconnaissance aircraft were already circling at altitude. The killing ground was perfectly lit, and the hunters were already in position. The attacks on the 5th of July were the worst single day of losses. 6 merchant ships were sunk by Luftwaffe aircraft, 6 more were sunk by U-boats. Among those lost that day were the SS Fairfield City, the SS Daniel Morgan, the SS Pancraft, the SS Washington, whose armed guard gunners, as already noted, survived in lifeboats for 10 freezing days before reaching Soviet shores, the Convoy Commodore's flagship River Afton, the SS Empire Byron, and others. By the end of that one day, 12 ships that had been part of PQ-17 2 days earlier no longer existed on the surface of the water. The attacks were coordinated and relentless, with Luftwaffe torpedo bombers and level bombers working in sequence as U-boats moved in on the trails of stricken vessels or surfaced to finish ships that had been abandoned. The experience of individual ships during this period resists easy summary because each hull's story was different courses, different distances from the Norwegian coast, different luck in the fog banks and ice fields that lay along the northern edge of the Barents Sea. Some ships were struck within hours of the scatter order. Others steamed for 2 or 3 days before being found. The Soviet tanker Azerbaijan, carrying a predominantly female crew, an extraordinary fact that speaks to the desperate conscription of every available person. The Soviet war economy required was bombed and set on fire, her cargo of linseed oil igniting. Her crew fought the fire and saved the ship. She reached Arkhangelsk. Azerbaijan's survival was the kind of story that wartime propagandists wrote about, and they did, but her survival was the exception, and the rule was the seabed. One episode from this period stands out with particular clarity in the historical record because it involved a decision made by one junior naval officer that saved 4 ships and the lives of their crews. On receiving the third scatter order on the evening of the 4th of July, Lieutenant Leo Gradwell of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, commanding the armed trawler HMS Ayrshire, decided not to proceed directly south toward Arkhangelsk. Gradwell's reasoning, as he later explained it, was straightforward. The most dangerous place to be was on the direct route to Russia, where every German aircraft and U-boat would be looking for ships. Instead, he gathered 3 merchant ships, Troubadour, Ironclad, and Silver Sword, and led them north, not northeast, not east, but north directly toward the ice pack. When they reached the edge of the Arctic ice, Gradwell took his small convoy into it. They pushed into the pack ice until they found a position where the ships could stop engines and lie still against the white backdrop of the ice field. The crews then did something that would have seemed implausible in any other context. They painted the ship's hulls and deck cargo white, using paint taken from Troubadour's cargo. They arranged the Sherman tanks lashed to Troubadour's deck into a rough defensive ring with loaded guns pointing outward, and they waited. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead and either did not see the ships against the ice or did not identify them as vessels of interest. Gradwell's 4-ship convoy survived the worst days of the hunt entirely by disappearing into the landscape. When they emerged and made for Arkhangelsk under corvette escort, they arrived on the 25th of July carrying their cargoes intact. The contrast between Gradwell's resourcefulness and the broader picture of the convoy's fate is almost too sharp to be comfortable. Here was a lieutenant with no special intelligence advantage, no elaborate planning, no orders from above, only the initiative to look at the map and ask, where would they not look? The answer he arrived at independently, under pressure, in the middle of an ongoing disaster, was exactly correct. His story does not redeem the disaster of PQ-17. Nothing redeems that. But it is a reminder that the resources of human judgment, applied without panic and without deference to conventional thinking, can sometimes navigate through catastrophe when conventional thinking has already made things considerably worse. The attacks continued with diminishing but still lethal intensity for the next 5 days. On the 6th of July, SS Pan-Atlantic was lost to Luftwaffe attack and SS John Witherspoon to U-255, a submarine that would be responsible for multiple kills during this period. From the 7th through the 8th of July, 5 more ships were sunk, including SS Olopana and SS Alcoa Ranger. The pace slowed as German forces exhausted sorties, as some ships found temporary refuge in the bays and inlets along the frozen coast of Novaya Zemlya, and as Soviet surface forces began to extend their patrol range westward to meet survivors. The last losses were SS Hoosier and SS El Capitan on the 10th of July. Over the entire period from the scatter order to the last sinking, the Luftwaffe flew more than 200 sorties and lost only 5 aircraft. The human experience of those days in the lifeboats and life rafts demands acknowledgement even in a form as summary as this chapter can provide. Men in the Arctic in summer are exposed to cold that does not kill as fast as the winter sea, but kills with the same certainty if rescue is delayed long enough. Hypothermia sets in within hours of immersion, even in summer Arctic water. Frostbite claims fingers and toes in lifeboats that are open to the wind. Dehydration sets in because drinking seawater accelerates it. The men who survived longest in the lifeboats did so through mutual care, keeping each other awake, maintaining physical contact for warmth, managing the rationed freshwater with the discipline of people who understood there was no margin for waste. The men of the armed guard aboard SS Washington, who refused to be rescued because they calculated that another ship stopping for them would become a target, and who reached the Soviet coast after 10 days afloat, were not operating in the realm of ordinary courage. The final accounting of losses in Convoy PQ-17, when fully tallied, was the worst suffered by any single Allied convoy in the Second World War. 24 merchant ships sunk, from a total of 35 that had left Iceland, 153 merchant seamen killed, 3,350 vehicles lost, 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, over 99,000 short tons of general cargo. Against this, the Germans lost 5 aircraft. Of the initial 35 ships, only 11 reached Arkhangelsk, delivering 70,000 short tons out of the 200,000 short tons that had departed Iceland. The deliveries that arrived amounted to roughly 35% of the cargo that had sailed. The rest was on the seabed of the Barents Sea, under water so cold that some of it will still be there when everyone alive today is gone. The aftermath brought recrimination, blame-shifting, and long official silences that said more than any inquiry concluded openly. Stalin and his naval advisors could not understand the scatter order, not tactically, not strategically, not in any framework that made sense to men who had watched their armies hold at Stalingrad through unimaginable losses. Chapter 7. The Survivors, Lifeboats, Ice, and the Will to Live. The Barents Sea does not forgive hesitation. The men who found themselves in lifeboats and life rafts after the scatter, after the torpedoes and the bombs and the fire, entered a world that demanded total and continuous engagement simply to remain alive. There was no waiting out the danger in comfort. There was no safe corner of the raft where you could stop thinking and simply endure. The cold came from below, through the thin wooden planks of the lifeboat bottom, up through boot leather and trouser cloth and every layer a man was wearing. It came from the sides as spray broke over the gunwales and dried in a thin glaze of ice on every surface. And it came from above, because even in the Arctic summer, the wind at sea carries a chill that ordinary land-based cold does not prepare a person to understand. The men in those boats understood quickly that the cold was the first battle, and that it was as relentless as any enemy they had ever faced. The lifeboats and rafts from different ships found themselves in vastly different situations depending on where and when their vessels had been sunk. Some were within sight of other ships, scattered convoys always left pieces of themselves visible on the horizon, and survivors of one sinking could sometimes watch, with a helplessness they never entirely recovered from, as another ship was hit and another group of men entered the water. Some lifeboats were picked up within hours, by rescue ships still functioning, by Soviet vessels pushing westward, or by the occasional Allied naval craft that had not entirely abandoned the area. Others were not. Some drifted for days. Some reached the rocky coasts of Novaya Zemlya, a desolate Russian archipelago that was not inhabited in any helpful sense, but at least offered land, and some shelter from the open sea wind, and the possibility of being found by Soviet patrol craft that worked along that coastline. The difference between being found quickly and not being found quickly was, for many men, the difference between living and dying. The rescue ships assigned to PQ-17 Rathlin, Zamalek and Zafaran had remained with the convoy after the scatter order, because their function made no sense anywhere else. They moved through the debris field of the convoy's destruction, pulling men from the water, from rafts, from lifeboats, and into the cramped but warm accommodation they had been built to provide. The crews of these ships operated under conditions that are difficult to describe without the vocabulary of horror that this script has committed to avoid. What can be said is that the rescue ship crews worked continuously, slept when they could, and made decisions about who could be saved by available means that no human being should routinely be asked to make. Zafaran was herself sunk on the 5th of July by a German bomber. The rescue ship became a victim requiring rescue. her survivors pulled aboard Zamalek, which continued its work. The coast of Novaya Zemlya, that long, narrow archipelago stretching north into the Kara Sea, became an unexpected gathering point for a number of PQ-17's surviving vessels, and the men who had abandoned ship and found their way to its shores or were caught in its bays by ice. Novaya Zemlya had a small Soviet weather station at Matochkin Shar, the strait that divides the archipelago's two main islands, and a handful of other stations scattered along the coast. The men who straggled to these points found Soviet hospitality that varied enormously by location. At some points, they found warmth, food, and radio contact with Soviet command. At others, they found only the bare fact of being on land rather than water, and had to wait for Soviet patrol vessels to work their way around the coast and find them. The Soviet Navy's response to the disaster unfolding off their coastline was, under the circumstances, genuinely substantial small warships pushed westward into the Barents Sea to pick up survivors and escort the remaining merchant vessels toward Arkhangelsk, despite operating at the very edge of their own range and capability. Some of the most extraordinary survival stories from the aftermath of PQ-17 involve men who did not simply endure their circumstances, but actively navigated them. The armed guard crew of the SS Washington, already mentioned in the previous chapter, made a conscious decision to refuse rescue from a nearby vessel on the grounds that stopping to take them aboard would make the rescue ship a target, and they did not wish to transfer their danger to others. They sailed and rowed their lifeboat for 10 days, covering distance that should not have been possible in an open boat in those waters, eating the limited rations aboard and managing their fresh water with the precision of people who had done the mathematics of survival and knew there was no room for error. When they reached the Soviet coast and were helped ashore by Russian fishing communities, some of the men could not walk. None of them were dead. This is not a small thing. The survivors who reached Arkhangelsk by whatever route, on whatever timeline, arrived into a city that was itself under severe strain. Arkhangelsk, in the summer of 1942, was a working Soviet port that had been handling the incoming tide of Allied supplies for almost a year, while simultaneously managing the demands of a Soviet military and civilian economy under extraordinary pressure. The facilities were adequate rather than comfortable. The reception given to Allied merchant seamen varied, generally warm at the human level between Soviet dock workers and the sailors who had brought them supplies, more formal and sometimes frustrating at the official level where Soviet bureaucracy interacted with Allied military administration. Translation was a persistent problem. Medical care was provided, but the Soviet medical system in that city at that time was stretched across many needs simultaneously, and the care available was not always equivalent to what the men needed. The psychological weight of what the survivors carried is something the official records only partially capture. These were civilian merchant sailors, men who, in the culture of their profession and their generation, did not talk about fear and did not describe trauma in the vocabulary that later decades would develop for it. They described practical things: the color of the water, the sound a ship makes when it breaks up, the weight of a shipmate's arm over yours in a lifeboat to share warmth. These details, scattered through the oral histories and written memoirs that survivors left, form a kind of mosaic that the official reports do not contain. A naval action report describes a ship as sunk by torpedo at position X time Y with Z survivors. It does not describe what Z survivors looked like when they were helped over the side of a rescue vessel, or what they said to each other in the hours after, or what they dreamed about for the rest of their lives. The gap between the official record and the human record of PQ-17 is vast, and it is important to acknowledge that gap rather than simply fill it with the official version. One group of survivors whose story cuts against the general silence with particular force is the men who reached Novaya Zemlya and waited there sometimes for a week or more before Soviet vessels found them. The island offered land, which is psychologically significant even when land provides very little practical assistance. Men who had been at sea in open boats for days experienced the simple solidity of ground under their feet as something close to miraculous, even when the ground was permafrost and the shelter was a minimal Soviet outpost or, in some cases, simply the lee side of a rock. They built fires from whatever driftwood the coast offered. They pooled whatever food remained in their boats. They watched the horizon for the Soviet patrol vessels they had been told were coming. In some cases, the vessels came quickly. In others, there were days of waiting during which the men managed the paradox of being safe from immediate sinking while still potentially in danger from exposure, hunger, and the injuries sustained during the sinkings. What the survivors carried home eventually, through the complex logistical chain of wartime repatriation, was not primarily a political or strategic understanding of what had happened to them. Most merchant sailors were not in the business of assessing Admiral Pound's decision-making process or the intelligence failure that had led to the scatter order. What they carried was a more direct and more personal kind of knowledge, that they had been in a situation where the system that was supposed to protect them had withdrawn, and that they had been required to survive through their own resources. Some of them were angry about this, some were not. Some simply returned to sea as their employment contracts, the lack of any alternative income, and in many cases their own professional identity required, and sailed again on subsequent Arctic convoys. The human capacity to continue in the face of demonstrated risk is one of the genuinely difficult things to explain about this period of history. It does not fit easily into the categories of heroism or stoicism or fatalism. It is something more specific and less rhetorical than any of those words suggest. The total number of Allied merchant seamen who died in the Arctic convoys during the entirety of the war was approximately 3,000. Of those, 153 died in the PQ-17 disaster specifically. Set against the total loss of life in the Second World War, these numbers are small. Set against the numbers of men who sailed the Arctic and did not die, they are a reminder of the probability calculations that every man who signed on for the Murmansk run made, consciously or otherwise, before the ship left harbour. Those calculations did not prevent them from sailing. That fact alone, the simple continuity of departure, voyage by voyage, after PQ-17 had made clear what the worst case looked like, is one of the most human and most understated facts of the entire story. Chapter 8. The Politics of Disaster Blame, Silence, and Broken Alliances. When news of the PQ-17 disaster began to filter through the layers of wartime censorship and official restraint, it landed differently in London, Washington, and Moscow, and the differences in how the three Allied capitals absorbed what had happened tell you something important about the fundamental tensions within an alliance that had been forged by necessity rather than by any genuine convergence of values or interests. In London, the official response was the characteristic British manoeuvre of formal inquiry combined with informal suppression, an inquiry whose findings were classified, a narrative that attributed the catastrophe to unfortunate intelligence rather than to poor judgment, and a collective agreement among senior officers that the details of what had happened and why would not be made public for as long as wartime censorship provided justification for silence. Churchill's private characterization of PQ-17 as one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war was about as candid as official Britain allowed itself to be. In Washington, the reaction was sharper and less contained, at least in private. The fact that PQ-17 had been the first joint Anglo-American naval operation under British command was not lost on the American officers who had watched 14 of the 35 ships in the Convoy 14. American vessels go to the bottom because a British admiral had issued an order based on uncertain intelligence. Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, and a man not known for diplomatic restraint in his private assessments, was furious. The loss of American ships, American cargo, and American merchant sailors under British command, as a result of a British decision that American officers had not been consulted about, generated a level of Anglo-American friction that those managing the alliance in 1942 found genuinely alarming. The relationship between the two navies, which would need to function smoothly for the remainder of the war, was damaged in ways that required months of careful management to partially repair. Stalin's response was the most politically consequential of the three. The Soviet leader had been pressing Britain and the United States for a second front in Western Europe throughout 1942, an invasion that would force Germany to divert forces from the Eastern Front and relieve the catastrophic pressure on the Red Army. Churchill had been resisting this demand, arguing that a premature cross-channel invasion would be a military disaster, while offering the Arctic convoys as a concrete demonstration of Allied commitment to the Soviet cause. When PQ-17 ended in the loss of two-thirds of its cargo that Stalin had been counting on for the summer offensive season, the convoy disaster became not merely a military setback, but a political wound increased. The three-way relationship that Churchill had to manage with great care. Stalin interpreted the scatter order as evidence that British commitment to the Soviet Union was conditional and that British admirals would not risk their ships to protect Soviet supplies. This interpretation was not entirely wrong. The immediate practical consequence of the disaster was the suspension of Arctic convoys. No convoy sailed the Murmansk run from July through September of 1942. The Admiralty, shaken by the scale of the losses and genuinely uncertain about how to structure the next convoy operations in a way that would not produce the same result, requested and received an agreed pause. This pause was not announced publicly in its true dimensions. The official explanation was operational weather, resources, the need to reorganize. The real reason was that no one was confident they knew how to run the next convoy safely, and the reputational damage of a second PQ-17 was something none of the Allied governments believed they could absorb. The gap in supply deliveries to the Soviet Union during those 3 months was significant. The Red Army was fighting at Stalingrad. The equipment that did not arrive was not an abstraction. The inquiry process in Britain followed its own particular logic. The Board of Admiralty reviewed the actions of convoy PQ 17 inches the months following the disaster. Its conclusions were never made public during the war. The board found that the scatter order had been issued by the First Sea Lord on the basis of intelligence that seemed to indicate an imminent threat from Tirpitz, and that the decision, while ultimately mistaken in its assessment of that threat, had not been unreasonable given what was known at the time. This conclusion was not dishonest in the strict sense. Pound had indeed acted on his best understanding of the intelligence. But it was incomplete, because it did not address the question of whether the scatter order was the right response to even a confirmed Tirpitz threat. The logic that compactness of formation was better protection against a surface threat than dispersal was, as several naval analysts would later argue, quite defensible, and the board did not engage with it. Commander Jack Broome, who had commanded the close escort and had received the scatter order with what he described as professional horror, spent much of the rest of his life seeking acknowledgement that the decision had been wrong. He wrote his own account of the convoy and its destruction, published in 1960. He pursued legal action against the journalist David Irving, whose 1968 book on PQ-17 implied that Broome had been responsible for abandoning the merchant ships, an accusation that was factually incorrect, since Broome had been given no choice in the matter by the Admiralty's direct order. The court case, in 1970, produced a verdict in Broome's favour, but required him to relitigate the worst experience of his professional life in open court. The legal process both vindicated him and forced him to carry the weight of the event publicly, decades after it had happened, at a stage of life when he might otherwise have been allowed to let it rest. The merchant sailors themselves had no inquiry, no board of review, and no official acknowledgement of their specific experience for many years. The merchant navy occupies a peculiar position in British collective memory of the Second World War essential, acknowledged in general terms, but rarely given the specific and individual recognition that military services receive. The men of PQ-17 who survived and returned to sea, and many did not receive campaign medals that specifically marked the Arctic service for many decades. It was not until 1995 that the Arctic Star Campaign Medal was officially established for those who had served in Arctic convoy operations. For many veterans, this recognition arrived after they had already died, waiting for it. The acknowledgement of what they had done came too late to be given to the men who had most deserved to receive it, and that lateness is itself a kind of verdict on how the institutions that sent them into those waters valued them afterward. The diplomatic consequences of PQ-17 extended beyond the immediate Anglo-American tensions and the problem of Stalin's fury. The disaster demonstrated, in terms that could not be dismissed, the fundamental tension between two competing strategic requirements: the need to maintain supply deliveries to the Soviet Union and the inability of Allied naval forces to guarantee adequate protection for the convoys when German surface forces, air power, and submarines were all simultaneously deployed against them in confined waters under ideal visibility conditions. This tension did not resolve itself in the summer of 1942. It remained a structural problem throughout the remaining years of Arctic convoy operations, managed through a combination of improved escort strength, better intelligence, changed routing, and the gradual degradation of German air power in Norway as the war progressed. But in the summer of 1942, none of those improvements had yet occurred, and the diplomats managing the three-way alliance were left working with what the generals and admirals had left them after PQ-17: a broken promise, a missing 3 months of supply convoys, and a relationship that would never again be quite as assumed as it had been the week before the 27th of June. The role of intelligence failure in the disaster requires one more turn of examination at this stage of the story, because it connects the specific catastrophe of PQ-17 to a broader pattern in Allied intelligence management during this period of the war. The Allies had Bletchley Park, an asset of extraordinary value, whose limitations in the summer of 1942 were, paradoxically, partly a product of its earlier successes. The German naval enigma key change in February of 1942, which had temporarily blinded Bletchley to U-boat communications, was being slowly worked around. But the surface ship communications that Bletchley could read were read with a time delay. The intelligence arrived hours after the events it described, sometimes too late to affect decisions being made in real time. The human analysts at Bletchley, including Norman Denning, were making careful and professionally responsible assessments of what the intelligence meant. But between a careful professional assessment delivered by an officer in London and a First Sea Lord sitting with the full weight of responsibility for 35 ships and their crews, there was a gap in which catastrophe had room to happen. What the PQ-17 disaster ultimately forced the Allies to confront was the question of how to make strategic decisions under conditions of genuine, irreducible uncertainty, and whether the institutional cultures of military command, with their emphasis on decisive action and clear lines of authority, were adequate to situations where the right action was to wait, to gather more information, and to resist the pressure to act simply because action was available. Pound acted. His action was wrong. The merchant sailors in the Barents Sea paid the price of that action's wrongness for 5 days and 5 nights under a sun that never set. The question of whether a different institutional culture, one that valued acknowledged uncertainty more than confident decision, would have produced a different outcome, is not answerable. What is answerable is that the question itself became one of the lessons that Allied command attempted, with varying success, to incorporate into the remainder of the war. Chapter 9: The German Side Hunters in the Midnight Sun. The German officers and men who pursued the scattered ships of PQ-17 across the Barents Sea in the first 10 days of July 1942 were not a monolithic force with a single coherent plan. They were two distinct arms of the German military machine, the Kriegsmarine submarine service and the Luftwaffe's anti-shipping units, operating in rough coordination, sharing targets of opportunity rather than executing a precisely synchronized plan, and competing in some informal sense for the credit of a tactical success that both services wanted to claim as their own. The rivalry between the German Navy and the German Air Force was not merely bureaucratic. It shaped tactics, communication, and the allocation of resources in ways that sometimes served the German war effort and sometimes hampered it. In the particular case of PQ-17's destruction, the rivalry was essentially irrelevant to the outcome. Both services had more targets than they could efficiently process, but it would matter in future convoy operations where coordination gaps could be exploited. The U-boats assigned to the operation against PQ-17 were grouped as Wolfpack, Eisdeuffel, Ice Devil, a name that suited the waters in which they operated and the manner in which they hunted. After the scatter order was issued, the tactical situation that the submarine commanders found themselves in was, from a purely military perspective, almost without precedent in terms of its favorability. Instead of a compact convoy surrounded by anti-submarine escorts whose ASDIC sets and depth charges made submerged approach extremely dangerous, the U-boat commanders now had individual merchant ships on known courses, in clear weather, with no effective anti-submarine cover, spread across several hundred square miles of ocean. The problem of target selection was not shortage, but abundance. Individual U-boats could surface in daylight. The midnight sun meant there was no natural concealment advantage to being submerged, and surface running was faster and moved from target to target at speeds that would have been suicidal near a properly escorted convoy. Among the individual submarine commanders active during this period, U-255, commanded by Reinhard Recce, was particularly active, accounting for multiple sinkings during the chase phase. U-456, commanded by Max Martin Teichert, was another vessel whose log from those days recorded a series of engagements that, stripped of their official naval language, describe a systematic process of locating and sinking individual ships whose crews had no reasonable means of defense against a submerged submarine attack. The German submariners were not, in the individual human sense, different in character from the Allied sailors they were killing. They were young men operating under military orders in an extreme environment, subject to fear and cold and exhaustion in their own right, though not to the particular vulnerability of an unarmed merchant vessel on a flat, bright sea. The distinction between the tactical circumstances of hunter and hunted in those days was absolute. The Luftwaffe's contribution to the destruction of PQ-17 was concentrated primarily in the first 2 days after the scatter order, when weather conditions and aircraft availability combined to allow sustained operations. Air Fleet 5 flew more than 200 sorties during the entire operation against the convoy, from initial shadowing through the final attacks on the 10th of July. The aircraft types most effective against scattered merchant shipping in those conditions were the Junkers Ju-88 bombers, operating in the level bombing role against stationary or slow-moving targets, and the Heinkel He-111 torpedo bombers, whose low-level attack profiles were particularly well suited to conditions in which the target ship could not maneuver effectively. The Ju-87 dive bombers, which had been devastatingly effective against merchant shipping in the Mediterranean and English Channel, were less dominant in the Arctic due to the longer ranges involved and the aircraft's limited endurance. The pilots and crews of Air Fleet 5 operated from bases at Banak, Bardufoss and Kirkenes on the Norwegian mainland, and flew long overwater sorties across the Barents Sea to reach their targets. These were not short missions. A round trip from Banak to the area where the scattered convoy ships were operating could take 6 or more hours in each direction, depending on the aircraft type and the specific target location. The crews flew in aircraft that had no effective heating, over water in which survival time after ditching was measured in minutes. They navigated primarily by dead reckoning and radio bearings, in an environment where the featureless Arctic horizon provided almost no navigational reference. The BV-138 flying boats served as navigational leaders on some sorties, guiding bomber formations to the vicinity of targets identified by reconnaissance. This coordination was imperfect and sometimes broke down, but in the conditions of the first 5 days after the scatter order, clear weather, targets spread across a known sea area on predictable courses, imperfect coordination was sufficient to achieve devastating results. The aftermath of individual attacks, as recorded in Luftwaffe mission logs and the memoirs of German aircrew, describes a landscape of destruction that expanded across the Barents Sea with each successive sortie. Ships on fire, ships stationary in the water, already listing and beginning to settle, lifeboats visible from the air, pulled by their occupants away from burning hulls. The German aircrew were, in the vast majority of cases, professional enough to avoid deliberate attacks on lifeboats and life rafts, a distinction that matters morally even in a context of war. There were individual exceptions, reported by survivors, but the general pattern of Luftwaffe conduct in the maritime environment was to target ships rather than survivors, consistent with the requirements of the laws of naval warfare as they existed and were understood at the time. This does not diminish the catastrophe that their missions contributed to. It is simply an accurate description of how they operated and accuracy matters more than simplification. The surface force component of the German Operation Tirpitz, Hipper, Lützow, Scheer, and their destroyer escorts ultimately contributed nothing to the destruction of PQ-17 beyond the threat of their existence. Tirpitz sortied briefly from Altenfjord on the 5th of July after the scatter order had already been issued and the ships of PQ-17 were already being hunted individually. The sortie was abandoned within hours, when reconnaissance remained unable to confirm the carrier threat that Hitler's standing orders required to be eliminated before the capital ships could engage. The battle group returned to port. In the entire operation against PQ-17, not a single round was fired by a German surface vessel. The convoy had been destroyed by a threat that never materialized. The ghost of Tirpitz, the idea of the ship rather than its physical action, had done more damage than the ship itself ever did in her entire operational career. This is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates something important about the nature of sea power in this period of the war. The value of a large surface warship in 1942 was not primarily in what it did when it engaged. It was in what the enemy was forced to do and to sacrifice simply in response to the possibility of engagement. Tirpitz, by existing in a Norwegian fjord, held down Allied capital ships that could not be risked while she remained afloat. By moving to Altenfjord in early July, she forced a series of decisions in London that destroyed the convoy she never fired upon. The final irony that her movement toward the convoy ultimately triggered her own recall due to the carrier threat is a kind of operational dark comedy in which nobody wins cleanly, but the losing is done entirely by the men in the merchant ships who had no part in the strategic chess match and no way to influence its outcome. The German submarine and air crews who participated in the destruction of PQ-17 returned to their bases in Norway, carrying a tactical success of substantial proportions. 24 ships, roughly 400,000 tons of shipping, and more than 100,000 tons of war cargo had been destroyed in approximately 7 days of combat operations with the loss of 5 aircraft, and as far as records indicate, no U-boats. From a purely operational perspective, the results were extraordinary. Grand Admiral Raeder submitted his report to Hitler with the numbers, and Hitler, who had been skeptical about the entire operation and had almost forbidden it on grounds of risk to the major surface units, received the news of the convoy's destruction with a satisfaction that, according to German naval staff records, was somewhat tempered by the knowledge that Tirpitz had achieved it by staying in port. The tension between Hitler's desire for dramatic naval victories and his unwillingness to risk the ships that would be required to achieve them did not resolve itself around the results of PQ-17. It continued, progressively degrading the effectiveness of the German surface fleet for the remainder of the war. The German success against PQ-17 had a strategic dimension that its architects understood with great clarity. It demonstrated that the Arctic route could be closed if Germany chose to focus its Norwegian-based forces against it during the summer months of perpetual daylight. This demonstration forced the Allies to either suspend summer convoys surrendering the supply line for months each year or find ways of protecting convoys in summer conditions against a coordinated air submarine surface threat for which no adequate solution yet existed. The 3-month suspension that followed PQ-17 was the direct result of this demonstration. And in the 3 months that no Allied convoys reached Arkhangelsk or Murmansk, the Soviet armies fighting at Stalingrad received that much less of the material that the Allies had promised Stalin and had been attempting to deliver. The second-order consequences of 7 days of hunting in the Barents Sea reached all the way to the streets of that burning city on the Volga, though neither the German aircrew at Banach nor the surviving merchant sailors at Arkhangelsk could have traced the connection at the time. Chapter 10. The Murmansk Run continues rebuilding after the ruins. The decision to suspend Arctic convoys in the wake of PQ-17 was not made lightly, and it was not received lightly by anyone who understood what the suspension meant in practical terms for the Soviet war effort. The Admiralty's position, stated plainly in its communications to Churchill and to the American Naval Command, was this: until the problem of operating convoys through summer Arctic waters against a coordinated German air, surface, and submarine threat could be addressed with better tools, better air cover, heavier escort forces, improved intelligence. Sending another large convoy in the summer of 1942 was likely to produce results comparable to or worse than PQ-17, and the cumulative loss of Allied merchant shipping in 1942 was already pushing the limits of what replacement building could compensate. The case for suspension was strategically sound. It was also politically necessary because neither Churchill nor Roosevelt could afford to preside over a second disaster of PQ-17's magnitude while explaining to Stalin why the second front he wanted continued to be deferred. The diplomatic handling of the convoy suspension required Churchill to travel personally to Moscow in August of 1942, one of the most demanding diplomatic missions of his wartime career, and tell Stalin, face to face, not only that there would be no second front in 1942, which he had already communicated, but that there would also be no more Arctic convoys until September at the earliest. The meeting, by all accounts, was severe. Stalin pressed Churchill with a directness and hostility that even experienced diplomats found unsettling. Churchill's account of the meeting in his memoirs describes an atmosphere of barely controlled fury on the Soviet side, and the sense that the alliance was under genuine strain. What held it together was the mutual recognition by both men, in the pragmatic corners of their thinking, that operated beneath the rhetoric, and the accusation that the alternative to the alliance was unthinkable. Britain and the Soviet Union needed each other because the Germans were still winning. That calculation had not changed. The period from July through September of 1942 was used by the Allied naval commands to do what the pause had been justified to accomplish: rethink the escort arrangements and force compositions for future Arctic convoys. Several conclusions emerged from this review. First, close escort forces needed to be substantially heavier not just in numbers of corvettes and destroyers, but in the caliber of anti-aircraft armament available, so that a convoy could mount a credible defense against the coordinated torpedo bomber and level bomber attacks that had proved so effective against PQ-17. Second, the covering cruiser force needed clear operational rules that distinguish between the risk of engaging German cruisers acceptable and the suicidal proposition of engaging Tirpitz not acceptable, so that the cruiser force's withdrawal did not automatically trigger the destruction of the escort it was designed to reinforce. Third, and most critically, the anti-aircraft ship cover needed to be permanently attached to the convoy rather than sailing at distance as covering force. The question of air cover was the most intractable. Aircraft carriers could in principle provide effective fighter cover over a convoy against Luftwaffe attack, but the carriers available in the Royal Navy in 1942 were neither numerous enough nor individually capable enough to guarantee coverage across the full extent of a convoy operation in Arctic waters. The solution that began to emerge during this period was the Mac ship concept, and eventually the escort carrier, a merchant hull modified to carry a small number of aircraft. These were not fleet carriers. They were slow, limited in aircraft capacity, and unable to sustain carrier aviation operations in the worst Arctic weather. But they could keep fighters in the air over a convoy during a German air attack, and they could mount anti-submarine patrols ahead of and around the convoy during the vulnerable approaches. The first escort carrier to operate on the Arctic route would not be available for several more months. In the interim, the convoys would sail with what they had. Convoy PQ-18, which sailed in September of 1942, of the first convoy to run, after the summer suspension, carried the experience of PQ 17 inches, every aspect of its organization. The escort was massively reinforced. 40 naval vessels were assigned to accompany a convoy of 39 merchant ships. The escort carrier HMS Avenger joined the convoy with 3 anti-submarine Swordfish aircraft and 6 Sea Hurricane fighters. The convoy commodore's orders included explicit instructions for maintaining formation under attack, recognizing that the scatter order of PQ-17 had proven more lethal than any alternative. The Admiralty's signal discipline was tightened. The cruiser force's rules of engagement were clarified. Every lesson that could be extracted from the catastrophe of PQ-17 was applied, as systematically as the available resources and the available time permitted. The results of PQ-18, while still costly, demonstrated that the lessons had been at least partially absorbed. Of 39 ships that sailed, 13 were sunk a loss rate that was severe by any peacetime standard, but substantially better than the two-thirds attrition of PQ-17. The convoy reached the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe lost 41 aircraft in the operation, a cost that the German Air Force in Norway could not sustain indefinitely, and which began to change the calculus of sending bomber and torpedo formations against a convoy that was now shooting back with credible effectiveness. The escort carrier concept proved its value. Having fighters over the convoy forced the Luftwaffe to change its attack geometry, to approach at lower altitude with greater risk to aircraft, or to accept higher losses at medium altitude. Neither option was as good as the uncontested approach that had worked so well against the scattered remnants of PQ-17. The human dimension of rebuilding the convoy system after PQ-17 involved not just tactical and technical changes, but a quieter and less recorded kind of reconstruction, the repair of confidence among the merchant sailors who had survived the disaster and now faced the prospect of sailing the same route again. The men who had survived PQ-17 and returned to service were not naive about what they were returning to. They had precise, detailed, personal knowledge of what could happen, that they returned at all, that the merchant fleets continued to be crewed, that the ships continued to sail, that the replacements for the men who did not return continued to sign on, is a fact about human beings under extreme pressure that resists easy explanation. Economic necessity played a part. The culture of the sea played a part. The straightforward sense of duty that most of these men would have named, if asked, as the primary reason for their decisions played a part. What is clear is that the system rebuilt itself, and that the rebuilding was done by individual human choices made in port offices and signing halls and boarding gangways, where men looked at a ship and decided to step aboard it again. The convoys that followed PQ-18 through the autumn and winter of 1942 and into 1943 ran under a system that had been substantially reformed. The naming convention changed. The PQ and QP series were replaced by the JW series for outbound convoys and the RA series for homebound convoys, a change that was in part cosmetic but also reflected a genuine organizational reset. The escort forces grew heavier as the naval construction programs in both Britain and America began to deliver the smaller warships, destroyers, frigates, corvettes that had been laid down in the first years of the war. The intelligence picture improved as Bletchley Park's access to German naval communications became more comprehensive and more current. And the German position in Norway, while still formidable, began to be affected by the broader strategic pressures of a war that was gradually, painfully, and not yet visibly to the casual observer, beginning to turn in the Allies' direction. Tirpitz remained in Norwegian waters until the end, not because the Allies lacked the desire to destroy her, but because destroying a well-protected battleship in a Norwegian fjord proved to be an extraordinarily difficult problem. A series of attacks from the air and the sea, using conventional bombers, midget submarines, and eventually the massive tallboy bombs carried by RAF Lancaster aircraft, progressively damaged and ultimately sank her in the autumn of 1944. But until she was gone, she continued to perform the function she had always performed most effectively, the function of existing, of being a potential threat that required a response even when she never moved. The cost of neutralizing Tirpitz, measured in the resources the Allies had to maintain at readiness against her potential action, was substantial across the entire period of her survival. The men of PQ-17 who had been scattered by her shadow in July of 1942 would have found a particular satisfaction in knowing how much effort the Allies eventually devoted to her destruction. Chapter 11. What the cargoes meant, supplies, strategy, and Stalingrad. There is a kind of history that records events as chains of decisions made by the people at the top, by admirals and generals and heads of government, and there is another kind that asks what the consequences of those decisions looked like at the other end. The cargoes of PQ-17 that sank in the Barents Sea did not disappear from the war abstractly. Each tank that went to the bottom with a torpedoed freighter was a tank that was not waiting at a Soviet railhead in August of 1942. Each aircraft that went down with its crating did not fly over Stalingrad that autumn. The arithmetic of absence of what the Soviet military did not have because the convoys had been disrupted is one of the most difficult calculations in the entire history of the Eastern Front, because the Soviet command system did not record operational shortfalls in the way that invites clean retrospective accounting. But the broad shape of the numbers is there, and it matters to any honest assessment of what PQ-17 cost beyond the lives of its merchant sailors. The cargo that PQ-17 was carrying when it sailed from Falfjord on the 27th of June represented a substantial fraction of the total Allied supply commitment to the Soviet Union for that quarter. The 430 tanks aboard the convoy's ships were not an abstract contribution to Soviet armoured strength. In the summer and autumn of 1942, the Soviet armoured forces were fighting in conditions that destroyed equipment faster than domestic Soviet factories, already working at maximum capacity and partially displaced to the Urals, could replace it. The tanks that arrived from Britain and America through the Arctic convoys went directly into units that needed them to maintain the defensive lines that were, in the summer of 1942, the last barrier between German forces and the industrial and petroleum resources of the Soviet South and East. The loss of those tanks was not catastrophic by itself. The Soviet industrial output was by this point beginning to recover and expand, but it was not insignificant either. And it came at a moment when the margin between capability and requirement was thin. The aircraft component of the lost cargo is, in some respects, even more telling. 210 aircraft, a mix of types that included American Airacobras and Kitty Hawks, alongside British Hurricanes, were lost with the convoy. Soviet aviation in the summer of 1942 was in a period of painful transition between the older aircraft types that had equipped the pre-war Air Force and the newer Soviet designs, particularly the Yak and La, series fighters that were beginning to come off the production lines in the relocated factories east of the Urals. During the transition period, the Western aircraft supplied through Lend-Lease filled a gap that Soviet production could not yet cover. A significant proportion of the fighters operating over the Volga Bend during the Stalingrad campaign were American or British-built aircraft. The 210 aircraft lost with PQ-17 represent the aircraft that were not available in that context, and while it is impossible to trace a specific engagement or a specific outcome to their specific absence, the cumulative weight of the shortfall is part of the story of the Eastern Front in that period. The vehicle's 3,350 trucks, jeeps, tractors, and half-tracks are perhaps the most overlooked element of the lost cargo in popular accounts of PQ-17 because motor vehicles lack the dramatic resonance of tanks and aircraft. But the logistics of the Eastern Front in 1942 were, in a very direct sense, a contest of trucks as much as of guns. The German operational method depended on motorized supply columns that could move fast enough to keep pace with a blitzkrieg advance. The Soviet defensive doctrine, which was being improvised and revised under pressure during this period, required the ability to move reinforcements, ammunition, fuel, and food across distances that could only be covered at the required speed if sufficient truck capacity was available. The 3,000 American and British vehicles that were on the hulls of PQ-17 when it sailed represented a contribution to Soviet logistics capability that would have been felt across multiple fronts. Their loss was felt in the same way, not dramatically, not in the form of a single battle that was lost because of their absence, but quietly in the daily arithmetic of keeping an army supplied and mobile. The broader context of Lend-Lease supply to the Soviet Union places PQ 17 inches, a perspective that resists both maximalist and minimalist interpretations. The total American and British supply contribution to the Soviet war effort over the entire course of the war was substantial. 11,000 aircraft, 6,700 tanks, 375,000 trucks, and 15 million pairs of boots, among many other categories of material. Soviet historians, for political reasons that were specific to the Cold War period, consistently minimized the significance of this contribution, suggesting that it represented only a small percentage of total Soviet military output. Western historians sometimes overcorrected in the other direction, exaggerating the contribution to make a political point about Western generosity. The honest position, which most contemporary historians hold, is that the Lend-Lease contribution was not sufficient to have won the war by itself. Soviet military and industrial output was the primary engine of the Eastern Front's eventual reversal, but that it was substantial, enough to matter at specific critical junctures, and that the Arctic convoys were the primary mechanism by which the early and most urgent portions of that contribution were delivered. The strategic relationship between the Arctic supply route and the Battle of Stalingrad deserves particular attention, not because a direct causal link can be drawn with clean precision, but because the timeline is suggestive. The German offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields Operation Blue was launched in June of 1942. The city of Stalingrad became the focal point of the most intensive urban fighting of the entire war from August of 1942 onward. The Soviet counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army Operation Uranus was launched in November of 1942. In the months between the scatter of PQ-17 and the launch of Operation Uranus, the Soviet Union received no supplies through the Arctic route. The supplies that did arrive through the Persian Corridor and the Pacific route were slower, lower in volume, and less reliably delivered. The Soviet forces that launched Uranus were equipped and supplied primarily through Soviet domestic production. What the Arctic route suspension cost was the additional margin, the extra trucks, the extra aircraft, the extra boots that might have allowed the counteroffensive to be launched sooner or to be more powerful than it was. That cost is real, even if its precise dimensions cannot be calculated. The Persian Corridor, the route through Iran, had been opened in August of 1941, when British and Soviet forces jointly occupied the country to secure it against German influence and to establish a supply line that was not dependent on the Arctic weather or the Norwegian coast. The Persian Corridor was slower and more expensive per ton of cargo than the Arctic route. The railway capacity through Iran was limited. The port facilities at the head of the Persian Gulf were primitive, and the distances involved were enormous. But it was available year-round and was not subject to the German air and submarine threat that made the Arctic route so expensive in ships and men. The existence of the Persian Corridor was one reason why the 3-month Arctic suspension in 1942, while strategically costly, was not strategically fatal. The Soviet Union was not cut off, but the rate of supply delivery dropped substantially during those 3 months, and the shortfall was felt. The men who loaded those cargoes in American ports, Detroit workers who had built the tanks, Washington State workers who had built the aircraft, New England shipwrights who had assembled the Liberty hulls under the noise and pressure of wartime production knew, in the general terms that wartime public information allowed, that the equipment they were building was going to the Soviet Union by way of Britain and the Arctic. They did not know the details of what was happening to the ships that carried it. The censorship that surrounded the PQ-17 disaster was effective enough that the full story did not become publicly known until years after the war ended. The workers who built the tanks and aircraft that went to the bottom of the Barents Sea with the PQ-17 convoy did not know what had happened to their work. The Soviet soldiers who should have received that equipment and did not receive it did not know why it had not arrived. Only the men in the lifeboats and the men in the Admiralty and the men in the submarines and the men in the Luftwaffe aircraft knew exactly what had happened and why. The gap between what people knew and what was happening to the material of the war is one of the persistent conditions of industrialized conflict, and PQ-17 illustrates it with particular clarity. The final accounting of the strategic cost of PQ-17 has to include the damage done to Allied confidence in the viability of the Arctic route itself, a damage that persisted long after the convoy losses had been replaced and the supply system rebuilt. Every subsequent Arctic convoy was planned and executed in the shadow of PQ-17's example. The question that the disaster had posed, is it possible to run a large convoy through Arctic waters in summer against a coordinated German threat with any acceptable loss rate, was never definitively answered in the affirmative during the period of German strategic strength on the Norwegian flank. The Allies managed it, at cost, with progressively improving tools and methods. But the confidence that had characterized the earlier convoys, when the scale of the German counter-effort was not yet fully understood, was gone. In its place was a more accurate and more somber understanding of what the Arctic route required, and a determination based on the same hard pragmatism that had built the alliance in the first place to continue paying the price. Chapter 12. Reflections on command decisions made in darkness and doubt. The question that has followed Convoy PQ-17 through the decades since the summer of 1942, and will follow it as long as people study the history of naval warfare, is not a simple question about whether Admiral Dudley Pound made a mistake. Acknowledging that the scatter order produced catastrophic results is easy. It is the simplest thing in this story. The harder question is whether any human being in Pound's position, with Pound's information, under the institutional pressures that shaped the environment in which Pound was operating, would necessarily have decided differently. And if the answer to that question is that the decision was at least understandable even if it was wrong, then the further question becomes, what does that tell us about the systems and cultures of command that produced a decision with those characteristics? It is that larger question that gives PQ-17 its enduring relevance beyond the specific history of Arctic convoys in 1942. Pound was 64 years old in the summer of 1942. He had spent his entire adult life in the Royal Navy, rising through a system whose professional culture placed the highest value on decisiveness, the ability to assess a situation and act upon that assessment, without hesitation or visible uncertainty. The first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy was not expected to say, "I am uncertain," in front of his staff, or to acknowledge in a formal operational meeting that the right answer might be to do nothing and wait for more information. The culture demanded decision. The architecture of command, responsibility, single lines of authority, clear accountability, the chain of command that runs from the most junior rating all the way to the first Sea Lord reinforced this demand. When Pound sat in the Admiralty's operational room on the evening of the 4th of July and looked at a chart on which 35 merchant ships were steaming toward what might or might not be Tirpitz, he was a man shaped by 60 years of life in a culture that did not have adequate vocabulary for productive inaction. Norman Denning's role in the events of that evening is worth examining carefully because it illustrates the gap between what intelligence can provide and what decision-makers require from it. Denning was a careful, professional, and conscientious officer. His assessment of the intelligence picture was technically accurate. He could not confirm that Tirpitz had sailed, but he could say that the intelligence indicators that normally preceded a German surface sortie had not been observed. This was a precise and honest assessment of what the available evidence showed. What Pound needed, what the decision required, was not a precise and honest assessment of available evidence, but a confident answer to a binary question: is Tirpitz at sea, yes or no? Denning could not provide that answer, because the intelligence did not support it. The result was that a carefully qualified professional judgment, "I cannot confirm she has sailed," and the indicators suggest she has not, was received by a decision-maker under pressure as something closer to uncertainty than to reassurance, and acted upon accordingly. The fog of war, that old phrase, worn smooth by repetition, but still describing something real, operated not just at the level of Pound's decision, but at every level of the PQ-17 chain of command simultaneously. Commander Broome, on his destroyer, receiving the scatter order, did not know that Tirpitz was still in Altenfjord. The merchant captains, receiving the signal from the Commodore, did not know why they were being told to scatter, only that they were. The individual sailor on watch did not know that the destroyers pulling away to the west were leaving because the first Sea Lord in London had decided that German battleships might be nearby. Each level of the chain of command operated with a partial, imperfect picture of the situation, and made decisions or received decisions made above them without the context that would have allowed a different response. This is the condition of military operations at scale. It is not a uniquely British pathology or a specific failure of PQ-17's command structure. It is simply what war at sea looked like from inside the chain of command in 1942, and it is important to understand that structure rather than simply to assign blame to the individual at the top of it. The contrast between Pound's decision and Lieutenant Leo Gradwell's decision illuminates the difference between institutional command and improvised leadership at the tactical level. Gradwell, with HMS Ayrshire and 3 merchant ships, had no intelligence assessment, no Bletchley intercepts, no staff to advise him. He had a chart, his knowledge of the Arctic, and the simple observation that the direct route to Arkhangelsk was probably also the most dangerous route, given that German aircraft and submarines knew that scattered convoy ships would take the shortest available path. His decision to go north to take his small group into the ice, away from the predicted hunting grounds and the direct routes that every German reconnaissance aircraft would be watching, was a decision made without institutional framework, without orders, and without the knowledge that it would work. Gradwell simply looked at the problem from the outside, stripped of the assumptions that institutional training builds into a mind over decades of service, and asked the most basic tactical question available. Where would they not look? The answer he arrived at was correct. The ships he led survived. The contrast with Pound's decision is not a simple moral one. Gradwell was not a better man than Pound, and the complexity of Pound's position vastly exceeded anything Gradwell faced that night. But the contrast in method is instructive. Gradwell questioned the conventional response. Pound reached for it. The distance between those two choices, measured in outcomes, was the difference between 4 ships that arrived safely and 24 ships on the seabed. The role of fatigue and illness in Pound's decision-making is a thread that runs through most serious historical accounts of PQ-17, and it resists comfortable conclusions. By the summer of 1942, Pound had been running the Royal Navy through 3 years of war that had included the loss of HMS Hood, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, the fall of Singapore, and the disasters of the Channel Dash, when the German warships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen sailed through the English Channel in broad daylight in February of 1942 without effective Allied interception. Each of these had been events with significant professional and personal consequences for Pound. He had absorbed the criticism, managed the political fallout, and continued working. The cumulative physical and psychological weight of that sustained pressure, combined with the undisclosed brain tumour, whose effects were becoming more apparent to colleagues by the summer of 1942, produced a man who was not operating at the full capacity of the officer he had been earlier in his career. Whether a Pound at full capacity would have decided differently is a question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that the man who issued the scatter order was not well, and that the institutional culture of the Royal Navy in that period had no mechanism for acknowledging that a serving First Sea Lord might be too ill to make optimal decisions in a crisis. The lessons that the Allied naval commands attempted to extract from PQ-17 were practical rather than philosophical in their framing. More escorts, better air cover, clearer rules of engagement, improved intelligence. These were actionable conclusions, and they were acted upon as the substantially different outcome of PQ-18 demonstrated within 2 months. But the deeper lesson, the one about institutional command cultures and the way they process uncertainty, was not extracted in any systematic form, because the institutions doing the extraction were the same institutions that had produced the culture in question, and they were not in the habit of examining their own foundations while fighting a war. That deeper lesson remained available for later examination, and it has been examined by naval historians, by command theorists, and by the generations of military professionals who study PQ-17 precisely because it is a case study in decision failure that is not easily reducible to individual incompetence or individual courage. The failure was systemic in its roots, even though it was individual in its execution. The testimony of Commander Broome, both in his memoir and in the 1975 libel case against Irving, provides a specific human anchor to the abstract analysis of command failure. Broome described receiving the scatter order and immediately understanding what it meant for the merchant ships, not as an analytical conclusion reached after reflection, but as an instantaneous recognition that came with the signal's words. He knew, in the professional part of his mind, that had spent years understanding convoy doctrine, that scattered ships were dead ships in those conditions. He knew that the escort's departure removed the primary protection that made convoy sailing viable. He executed the order because he had no authority to countermand the First Sea Lord, and because military command does not function if officers selectively obey orders they agree with and disregard orders they do not. He lived with the consequences of that execution for the rest of his life. The institutional logic that required him to obey, and the human cost of what that obedience produced, constitute one of the genuinely tragic structures within this story, not a tragedy of fate, but a tragedy of correctly functioning systems producing catastrophic outcomes. The accounts of merchant captains who received the scatter order and made their own decisions about how to respond to it are scattered through the historical record in a way that reflects the decentralized nature of the disaster that followed. Some captains pushed hard for the ice, echoing Gradwell's instinct without knowing about Gradwell. Some followed the direct route at maximum speed. Some gathered with other ships for mutual protection until it became clear that small groups of merchant vessels without escort had no real ability to defend each other against submarine attack. Every decision made by every captain in those hours was made on incomplete information, with no communication from the naval command that had issued the order, in conditions of uncertainty that were themselves a product of the scatter, because once the convoy broke up, the communications network that a convoy's radio discipline provided also dissolved, leaving each ship in a kind of operational isolation that made coordination impossible. The captains did what they could. The ones who reached Arkhangelsk were not necessarily the ones who made better decisions. Sometimes survival in those circumstances was a matter of which patch of sea you happened to be crossing when the bomber formation went overhead. And luck is a factor in maritime warfare that no amount of tactical analysis can entirely eliminate. The judgments that history has rendered on the individuals involved in PQ-17's command decisions have shifted over the decades as documents were declassified and as the culture of historical reassessment broadened its scope. Pound has been treated harshly by some historians and sympathetically by others. The sympathetic treatments tend to emphasize the genuine uncertainty of the intelligence picture and the physical limitations under which he was operating. The harsh treatments tend to emphasize that the scatter order was wrong even on its own terms, that even if Tirpitz had been at sea and heading for the convoy, keeping the convoy together and fighting through would have been the doctrine that naval experience recommended. Hamilton and his cruiser force have been largely exonerated, since they were following orders and since their withdrawal, while leaving the convoy unsupported, was itself ordered by the Admiralty. Broome has been vindicated of any personal responsibility by both the Board of Inquiry and the courts. The merchant sailors have been honoured belatedly, insufficiently, but genuinely by the Arctic Star Medal and by the museums and memorial services that now mark what they endured. The particular cruelty of PQ-17's legacy is that it continued to unfold long after the last ship sank. The men who returned to sea on subsequent Arctic convoys carried the knowledge of what had happened. The families of those who did not return carried a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge that their husbands, sons, and brothers had died not in a direct military engagement, but as the consequence of an order issued by a man at a desk in London who had believed incorrectly that he was protecting them by sending them away. This is a kind of loss that does not fit easily into the narratives of wartime sacrifice that nations construct to make sense of what war costs them. The men of PQ-17 were not heroes of a successful operation. They were the victims of a failure, and the official culture of the countries that sent them struggled for decades to find an appropriate language for that kind of loss. It is a language that resists triumphalism and resists simplification, and it requires exactly the kind of honesty about institutional failure that official commemoration finds most difficult to sustain. The enduring significance of PQ-17 inches, the study of naval command, lies precisely in the fact that it was not a simple story of courage and cowardice, or of wisdom and stupidity. It was a story in which reasonably competent people, operating under genuine pressure with genuine uncertainty, made a decision that was defensible by the standards of their institutional culture and catastrophic in its real-world effects. That gap between what the institutional culture ratified and what the real world demanded is the lesson. It was a gap that existed in 1942 in the Royal Navy, and it exists in some form in every human organization that operates under pressure and uncertainty. The men who paid for that gap with their lives in the Barents Sea in July of 1942 deserve to be remembered not as symbols of an abstraction, but as specific people, specific names, specific ships, specific hours in specific lifeboats who encountered the full weight of that gap in the most personal way possible, and who survived it, or did not. As the mathematics of chance and the physics of cold water ultimately decided, they were there. The rest of us were not. And the least the rest of us can do is understand, as accurately as the evidence allows, exactly what they faced and exactly how it happened to them. If this story has stayed with you into these quieter hours, if you find yourself returning to these voices from the Arctic waters of 1942, then you are keeping something alive that deserves to be kept. Leave a comment below with the name of a ship or a man from this convoy whose story moved you. Subscribe to continue this journey when the next 6 chapters arrive. The story of PQ-17 does not end with the losses. It continues in the trials, the inquiries, the rebuilt convoys, and the long silence that governments maintained, while the men who had survived waited for the world to acknowledge what they had endured. Stay with us. Chapter 13. The long silence, censorship, memory, and the years after. There is a particular kind of institutional silence that is not the same thing as forgetting. Forgetting is passive, a gradual erosion of what was known, worn down by time and the replacement of one generation by the next. The silence that surrounded the story of Convoy PQ-17 for the years and decades after the summer of 1942 was active, maintained, and deliberate. It was the silence of governments that understood perfectly well what had happened and why, and had made a considered decision that the full account of those events was not compatible with the morale requirements of a war still very much in progress, or with the diplomatic requirements of an alliance still very much in need of management, or with the political requirements of a naval command that could not afford to publicly examine the decision-making of its most senior officer while that officer was still serving. The men who had been in the lifeboats knew what the silence was covering. The men in Whitehall who maintained it knew the same thing. What differed between them was the power to speak and the power to require others to remain quiet. The wartime censorship apparatus in Britain was comprehensive and, by the standards of a democratic country fighting for its survival, remarkably effective. The loss of 24 merchant ships in a single convoy operation was the kind of news that, if reported in full, could have had measurable effects on public morale, on the willingness of merchant sailors to sign on for subsequent Arctic convoys, and on the political management of the Anglo-Soviet relationship at a moment when Churchill was doing everything possible to maintain Stalin's confidence in Allied commitment. The official public account of PQ-17's fate was therefore carefully shaped, acknowledging losses in general terms, describing the convoy's difficulties without specifying their cause, and redirecting public attention toward the courage of the merchant sailors and the ongoing commitment to Soviet supply, rather than toward the administrative decision that had produced the disaster. This was not unique to PQ-17 wartime governments. On all sides managed information with the same combination of genuine security concern and political calculation. But the specific distortion applied to PQ-17 was particularly long-lasting because the security justification eventually expired while the political justification remained. The men who had sailed on PQ-17 and survived returned to ports that did not, by and large, ask them detailed questions about what had happened. The culture of the wartime merchant navy was not given to public expression of grievance or complaint. These were men who had grown up in a working culture that valued taciturnity. The sea punishes people who talk when they should be watching, and they returned to a civilian culture that was asking everyone to keep their experiences private for the duration. Their families received them with relief and asked only the questions that relief permits. The detailed accounts of what had happened in the Barents Sea in those July days existed primarily in official reports, in the private writings of a small number of individuals, and in the memories of the men themselves where they settled into the particular kind of internal architecture that wartime experiences build, not spoken of, but not forgotten, present in the nightmares and the silences and the reactions to ordinary things that triggered extraordinary memories. The first substantial public account of PQ-17 that went beyond the official narrative appeared in the years after the war ended, as the censorship apparatus gradually relaxed, and as individual participants began to write their own records. Alistair MacLean, the Scottish novelist who had served in the Royal Navy during the war and who had a specific connection to the Arctic convoy experience, drew on the world of the Murmansk run for his 1955 novel HMS Ulysses, a fictionalized account of an Arctic convoy that drew heavily on the physical and emotional reality of what those voyages had involved. MacLean's novel was not a direct account of PQ-17, but it introduced the general British reading public to a version of the Arctic convoy experience that was more emotionally honest than anything the official record had provided, and it sold in numbers that suggested the public was hungry for exactly that kind of engagement with what had been kept from them during the war. HMS Ulysses was not history, but it performed a function that the official histories of that period were declining to perform. It told people what it had actually been like. The more directly controversial public accounting of PQ-17 arrived with David Irving's 1968 book, which combined genuine archival research with interpretive conclusions that were contested by the participants. Irving's book attributed a greater degree of personal responsibility to Commander Broome than the evidence warranted, suggesting that Broome had been premature or excessive in his abandonment of the merchant ships. This interpretation led directly to the libel action that Broome brought and won in 1970. The court case was significant not just as a legal vindication for Broome, but as a public examination of the PQ-17 record that forced a degree of specificity onto questions that official history had been content to leave in. Deliberate vagueness, the detailed account of who ordered what, when, and on what authority that emerged from the legal proceedings provided the public with more precise knowledge of the command chain and its failures than anything the Admiralty had voluntarily released. Courts, operating under different rules than official histories, sometimes do what official histories decline to do. They require specificity, and specificity has a way of producing accountability, even when accountability was not the original intention of the proceeding. The declassification of relevant Admiralty records, which occurred in stages through the 1970s and 1980s as the standard 30-year rule on British government documents was applied, progressively filled in the picture that had been obscured since 1942. The signals, the intelligence assessments, the records of the Admiralty meetings at which the scatter order was discussed and issued, all of these eventually became available to historians who were equipped to read them in their full context. The picture that emerged from this documentary record was substantially more complex and more damning than the simple narrative of mistaken intelligence assessment that official accounts had offered. It confirmed that Denning had provided a qualified assessment rather than a confident warning. It confirmed that the scatter order had been issued by Pound personally, over the doubts of at least some of his senior colleagues. It confirmed that Tirpitz had not been at sea when the order was issued. The documents told a story of institutional failure operating through individual decision, and the historians who read them wrote accordingly. The impact on the families of those who had died was, for the most part, invisible to the official historical record, which is itself a commentary on whose experiences are captured and whose are not. The wives and parents and children of the 153 merchant sailors who died in PQ-17 had been told, in wartime, as much as the censorship apparatus allowed them to know. What they had not been told, and what many of them spent decades trying to find out, was the full story of how and why their men had died. The bureaucratic machinery of wartime compensation and pension entitlement treated merchant sailors differently from military sailors, often to the material disadvantage of the former. A naval officer's widow received specific entitlements under military law. A merchant seaman's widow received what the shipping company's contracts and the state's more limited provisions allowed. The difference between these two systems of post-death support was not merely financial, it reflected the ambiguous status of the merchant navy as both essential to the war effort and technically civilian in its employment. Structure. a status that produced real hardship for real families in the years after the war. The memorialization of PQ-17 followed the uneven trajectory of British public memory of the Second World War more broadly. For the first few decades after the war, the primary public commemorative framework for the conflict emphasized military victories, El Alamein, D-Day, the Battle of Britain rather than military disasters or the specific experiences of the merchant navy. The Arctic convoys occupied an awkward position in this framework. They were not a victory in any straightforward sense. The merchant navy lacked the institutional profile of the armed services in public commemoration, and the specific disaster of PQ-17 was too closely associated with command failure to fit comfortably into a commemorative narrative built around courage and sacrifice. The result was a decades-long gap between the scale of what the Arctic convoy men had endured and the public recognition they received for enduring it. Museums addressed it. Local memorials were erected. Individual communities that had sent men on the Arctic run held their own services. But the national framework of recognition lagged behind, and when it arrived with the Arctic Star Medal in 1995, it arrived for many too late. The question of what accurate memory of an event like PQ-17 requires from the institutions responsible for public history is not merely academic. Memory of this kind has practical consequences. The lessons that PQ-17 offers about command under uncertainty, about institutional cultures of decision-making, about the gap between what intelligence can provide and what decision-makers demand from it. These are lessons with direct relevance to military planning, to intelligence management, and to the organization of complex operations under pressure. If PQ-17 is remembered only as a story about brave sailors who suffered a terrible fate, those lessons are lost. If it is remembered as a story about an admiral who made a bad call, the lessons are oversimplified. The version of the story that preserves the lessons is the one that holds all of the complexity together. The institutional culture, the intelligence failure, the physical condition of the decision-maker, the fundamental problem of command at distance, and the human cost paid by people who had no voice in any of the decisions that determined their fate. That version of the story is harder to maintain than either the simpler alternatives, and it requires exactly the kind of sustained and honest attention to evidence that official institutional memory resists most strongly. The long silence that followed PQ-17, the decades between the event and the full public accounting, is itself part of the historical record, and it tells us something important about the cost of institutional self-protection when that self-protection comes at the expense of the people most directly affected by the events being protected against examination. The 153 men who died in the Barents Sea in July of 1942 waited, in the memories of those who survived them, for the world to say clearly and fully what had happened to them and why. The world said it, eventually. It said it in courts of law and in declassified archives and in the quiet rooms of naval museums where the signals and the charts and the photographs have been preserved. It said it incompletely and it said it late. But it said it, and the saying of it, the commitment to specificity and honesty about a difficult institutional failure, is the minimum that those men were owed, and the minimum that the practice of history owes to anyone who has paid the price of other people's decisions in full and without complaint. Chapter 14. The Tirpitz Problem, Hunting the Ghost Ship. The German battleship Tirpitz had destroyed convoy PQ-17 without firing a single shot, and this fact, this extraordinary inversion of conventional military logic, in which a weapon causes maximum destruction precisely by not being used, was not lost on the Allied commanders, who now had to decide what to do about a ship that had proven its strategic value through inaction. Tirpitz was, in the most precise sense, a fleet in being, a term from naval theory describing a force whose effect derives from its potential rather than its kinetic energy. As long as Tirpitz was alive and mobile in Norwegian waters, she required the Allies to maintain capital ship forces in readiness that could not be deployed elsewhere. She imposed operational constraints on Arctic convoy routing and timing that imposed real costs on every convoy that sailed, and she remained available for the kind of actual strike against a convoy that she had declined to make in July of 1942, Destroying her was therefore not simply a matter of revenge or strategic tidiness, it was a genuine operational priority that shaped Allied naval planning for 2 full years after PQ-17. The first serious Allied attempt to destroy Tirpitz in her Norwegian anchorage came in March of 1942 before PQ-17, during the period when the ship was based at Trondheim. Carrier-based aircraft from HMS Victorious flew the attack. The weather was poor, the attack was not effectively coordinated, and no hits were scored. Tirpitz returned fire and the aircraft withdrew. This early failure established a pattern that would recur. The fjords in which Tirpitz and her consorts sheltered were narrow, steep-sided, and provided natural protection against bombing attacks from any but the most precise angles, while the ship's own anti-aircraft armament and the shore-based flak batteries ringing her anchorages made any attacking force's approach extremely dangerous. Conventional high-altitude bombing, the mainstay of Allied air attack in this period, was poorly suited to hitting a ship maneuvering in confined waters, and the bomb types available in 1942 lacked the penetrating power to defeat Tirpitz's deck armor even with a direct hit. The solution that eventually proved decisive came from two different directions, separated by more than a year of costly and mostly unsuccessful attempts. The first was the midget submarine the X-Craft, a vessel roughly 51 feet long and displacing roughly 30 tons, crewed by 4 men and armed not with torpedoes, but with 2 large explosive charges designed to be placed on the seabed directly beneath a target ship. The X-Craft program had been under development in Britain since the early years of the war, driven by the specific problem of attacking heavily defended anchorages that surface and aerial attack could not penetrate. 6 X-Craft were assigned to the operation against Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Lützow in the autumn of 1943 Operation Source. 3 of the 6 reached their targets. 2, X6 and X7, successfully placed their charges beneath Tirpitz. The resulting explosions, on the 22nd of September 1943, damaged Tirpitz severely. Her main machinery was damaged, several gun turrets were put out of action, and her fire control systems were disrupted. She was not sunk, but she was out of effective action for approximately 6 months. The crews of the X-Craft that attacked Tirpitz were operating in conditions of near-suicidal difficulty. The midget submarines had to be towed from Scotland to the Norwegian fjords by conventional submarines, a voyage of several days in which the X-Craft were crewed by passage crews who would be replaced by the attack crews before the final approach. The towing itself was hazardous, the X-Craft uncomfortable beyond description, the navigational challenges of threading through the anti-submarine nets protecting Tirpitz's anchorage formidable. X5 was probably lost to German gunfire near the anchorage. The crews of X6 and X7, having placed their charges, scuttled their vessels and were captured surfacing to surrender to the very ship they had just mined, in a scene of particular intensity that the German sailors who hauled them aboard reportedly received with something closer to professional respect than hostility. The charges detonated while German sailors were still searching the midget submarines for intelligence material, and the men of X6 and X7 were aboard Tirpitz when her own mines went off beneath her. They survived. They received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration, the following year. The RAF's contribution to the destruction of Tirpitz spanned multiple operations across 2 years and required the development of a bomb specifically tailored to the problem. The Tallboy, a 12,000-pound penetrating bomb designed by Barnes Wallis, the same engineer whose bouncing bomb had been used against the Ruhr dams in May of 1943, was the weapon that eventually proved capable of defeating Tirpitz's armour. Tallboy was not a conventional bomb. It was an aerodynamically refined penetrator, designed to reach supersonic speed in its fall and to drive through deck armour and detonate deep within a ship's hull, or to strike the seabed beside the hull and collapse the hull plating through the shockwave of a near miss. Carried by specially modified Lancaster bombers of No. 6, 117 Squadron, the Dam Busters, the Tallboy required the aircraft to fly at altitude and bomb with precision beyond the standard capability of wartime bomber crews, demanding training and equipment that No. 6, 117 Squadron specifically developed. Operation Paravane, in September of 1944, was the first tallboy attack on Tirpitz. 27 Lancasters took off from a forward base in the Soviet Union Yagodnik, near Arkhangelsk, itself logistically connected to the Arctic convoy route, and flew to the Norwegian fjord where Tirpitz was anchored. One tallboy hit Tirpitz near the bow, causing severe flooding and structural damage. She was moved south to Tromsø, into shallower water, to prevent her sinking, a decision that brought her within range of Lancasters flying directly from Scotland, removing the need for the complex Soviet staging that Paravane had required. Operation Obviate in October of 1944 scored near misses that caused additional damage. Operation Catechism, on the 12th of November 1944, struck Tirpitz with 2 or 3 direct tallboy hits. The ship capsized within minutes in the shallow water of Tromsø Fjord. Of her crew of approximately 1,700 men, roughly 970 survived. 730 did not. The sinking of Tirpitz in November of 1944 released substantial Allied naval resources that had been committed to containing her for more than 3 years. The battleships and cruisers maintained at readiness to engage her should she sortie, the fleet air-arm squadrons kept available for carrier-based strikes, the intelligence resources devoted to tracking her movements, all of these could now be redeployed. The Arctic convoys, which by the autumn of 1944 had been running with progressively greater regularity and progressively lower loss rates as German air power in Norway declined and Allied anti-submarine capability improved, could now sail without the surface ship threat that had defined their operational planning since the first convoy of 1941. The practical effect of Tirpitz's removal on the specific management of the convoys was somewhat limited by this stage, since her period of maximum strategic effect had been in 1942, when she had destroyed PQ-17 without sailing. But symbolically, and in the accounting of what the Allies had spent to remove her, her sinking represented the closure of a chapter that had begun in the deep fjords of Norway in the summer before the scatter. The contrast between Tirpitz's strategic career and her actual combat record is one of the enduring ironies of the naval war. This was the most powerful warship the German Navy ever launched, a ship whose construction consumed enormous industrial resources, whose maintenance required a sustained logistical effort, and whose protection from Allied attack absorbed fighter squadrons, flak batteries, smoke-generating installations, and the constant attention of the Norwegian-based German command for years. In her operational life, Tirpitz fired her main armament in anger exactly once, a bombardment of shore installations on the island of Spitsbergen in September of 1943, a mission so militarily trivial that it has been described by historians as essentially a training exercise. She never engaged an Allied warship. She never sailed against a convoy after PQ-17's scatter had been caused by the threat of her presence alone. She was maintained, protected, repaired after X-craft damage, and ultimately sunk without ever having realized the military potential that had made her so terrifying and so expensive to the Allies. What the Tirpitz story tells us, ultimately, is something about the economics of naval deterrence in the Second World War, about the extraordinary cost-effectiveness, from a strategic perspective, of a weapon that achieves its purposes by being a credible threat rather than an active one. The Allied resources consumed in responding to the Tirpitz threat over 3 years, the capital ships kept at readiness, the carrier aircraft maintained for potential strikes, the convoy routes lengthened and complicated to avoid her potential sortie range, and eventually, the multiple bombing campaigns that were needed to sink her represented a strategic cost that vastly exceeded the actual damage she inflicted in direct military terms. This was not accidental. The German naval strategy of deploying major surface units in Norwegian fjords was specifically designed to produce exactly this asymmetry, to force the Allies to spend heavily on a threat that Germany could maintain relatively cheaply as long as the ships remained intact. PQ-17 was the most dramatic single demonstration of how effective this strategy could be. The ship that never fired a shot in that operation was the most destructive single weapon in its outcome. Chapter 15. The Wider Arctic War, 78 Convoys, and the Long Haul. PQ-17 is the name that history remembers from the Arctic convoys, and it deserves the attention it receives. But the full story of what those convoys accomplished across the entire course of the war is a larger story, and it risks being obscured by the singular catastrophe of July 1942 if it is not given its own space. From the first convoy in September of 1941 to the final convoy in May of 1945, 78 convoys made the Arctic passage in both directions. Of the 811 merchant ships that sailed outbound on the Arctic route, 720 arrived at their destinations. 91 were lost to U-boats, to aircraft, to weather, and in a small number of cases to the Arctic environment itself. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy ships that escorted them lost 18 warships of various types over the course of the campaign. The total human cost merchant sailors, naval escorts, and the crews of the German forces that opposed them ran into several thousands of lives across both sides. The 78 convoys that made up the complete Arctic campaign represent one of the most sustained logistical operations in the history of naval warfare, not the largest in absolute terms, but arguably the most physically demanding in terms of the conditions under which it was conducted. The convoys kept running through weather that would have suspended operations in virtually any other theatre. They ran through winter darkness, in which navigation by visual reference was impossible, and in which ice could appear from nowhere in the path of a convoy steaming in formation. They ran through summer daylight that eliminated the protective cover of night entirely. They ran when the escort forces were adequate and when they were not, when the intelligence picture was clear and when it was opaque, when the political pressure to deliver was highest and when the physical conditions of delivery were most hostile. The men who kept those 78 convoys running from the planning staffs in London and Washington to the captains of the merchant vessels and the ratings on watch in the escort destroyers were engaged in an act of sustained collective effort that does not resolve easily into the simple narratives of individual heroism that commemoration prefers. The material delivered by the Arctic convoys over the full course of the war was, as already noted, a significant component of the total Allied supply contribution to the Soviet war effort. The numbers involved more than 4 million long tons of cargo delivered to the Soviet Union through the Arctic route over the course of the war, represent equipment, food, and raw materials whose direct military significance is embedded in the larger question of what the Soviet Union needed and when, and whether it received it in time to matter at the specific moments of maximum need. The early convoys, running through the winter of 1941 to 42, provided the most time-critical supplies, the tanks and aircraft and boots that helped hold Moscow and Leningrad when the Soviet military's own production capacity had been partially destroyed by the German advance. The later convoys, running through 1943 and 1944, supplied a Red Army that was by then producing its own equipment in quantities that had overtaken the German output, but they supplied it with the additional margin that allowed it to maintain offensive operations across a front of more than 3,000 kilometers simultaneously. The human geography of the convoy route changed considerably between the first convoy of September 1941 and the last of May 1945. Murmansk, the first Soviet port reachable after rounding the North Cape, had been heavily bombed in the early years of the war at certain points in 1941 and 42. It was described by Allied sailors who saw it as largely a ruin, the wooden buildings that constituted much of its pre-war structure having burned repeatedly under German air attack. By 1944, the city had been substantially rebuilt and the port facilities restored to functional capacity. Arkhangelsk, further south in the White Sea and reachable only during the ice-free months, remained the primary destination for the largest convoys throughout the war. The Soviet port authorities who received the Allied convoys gradually developed working relationships with the Allied liaison officers stationed in both cities, relationships complicated by the Soviet security apparatus's deep suspicion of foreign contact, by the language barrier, and by the fundamental cultural differences between Western merchant sailors and the Soviet port workers and officials they encountered. These relationships were functional, sometimes warm at the individual level, and always bounded by the political framework of an alliance between powers that did not trust each other and knew it. The German effort against the Arctic convoys evolved continuously in response to Allied improvements, and the evolution of that effort traces a trajectory from initial success through increasing frustration to ultimate strategic failure. The Luftwaffe's anti-shipping operations in Norway reached their peak effectiveness in the period from the spring to the summer of 1942, the period that culminated in PQ-17's destruction. After PQ-18, when the improved escort arrangements reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to attack with impunity, German air attacks became progressively less effective as the Allies added escort carriers and improved anti-aircraft armament. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's anti-shipping capability in Norway had been substantially degraded, partly through losses of experienced crews who were not replaced in the Norwegian theatre as the demands of the air war over Germany increased, and partly through the diversion of aircraft types to other fronts where the Reich's strategic situation was more immediately critical. The U-boat campaign against the Arctic convoys followed a different pattern. German submarines remained a persistent threat throughout the entire campaign, more dangerous in some periods than others, adaptable to changes in Allied anti-submarine tactics, and never entirely eliminated from the operational picture. The introduction of improved Allied anti-submarine technology, particularly the Hedgehog head-throwing weapon, improved ASDIC sets, and centimetric radar that could detect a submarine snorkel at much shorter notice than earlier equipment, progressively shifted the balance of the undersea war in the Allies' favour from 1943 onward. But submarines, unlike surface ships, do not require favourable weather to operate, do not need to be visible from the air to attack, and can wait with patience that surface forces cannot match. The U-boats that preyed on the Arctic convoys continued to score individual successes through the final year of the war, even as the overall loss rate in the convoys declined sharply. The last merchant ship lost on the Arctic route was sunk by a U-boat in the spring of 1945, weeks before the German surrender. The Allied naval officers who commanded the later Arctic convoys operated within a framework that had been built imperfectly and at great cost from the lessons of the earlier operations, including PQ-17. The command arrangements for the cruiser covering force were clarified so that the ambiguity that had contributed to Pound's decision, the unclear boundary between the cruiser force's obligation to the convoy and its restriction against engaging capital ships, was resolved into more specific rules of engagement. The communication arrangements between the Admiralty and convoy commanders at sea were improved so that the situation that had developed in July of 1942, in which the First Sea Lord issued operational orders directly to a convoy at sea, without the detailed knowledge of local conditions that only the on-scene commander possessed, was less likely to recur. The intelligence machinery was refined, with better and more current reporting on German surface ship movements feeding into the operational planning process with less delay. None of these improvements eliminated risk. They managed it more intelligently. The relationship between the Arctic convoy campaign and the broader Allied strategy for winning the war is one that historians have approached from multiple angles, and the conclusions they reach tend to reflect their starting assumptions about what factors were most decisive in the Allied victory. The straightforward strategic case for the Arctic convoys is that they kept the Soviet Union supplied at the critical early period of the Eastern Front War, contributing to the Soviet ability to hold the German advance and eventually to counterattack. That they demonstrated Allied commitment to the Soviet cause in a way that was politically essential to maintaining the three-power alliance, and that they tied down German naval and air forces in Norway that would otherwise have been available for other operations. The case against their strategic significance, or at least against their sufficiency as an explanation for anything, is that the Soviet Union's own production capacity was the primary engine of the Eastern Front's eventual reversal, and that the Arctic convoys supplied the margin rather than the substance of Soviet military power. Both of these positions are defensible. The honest assessment is that both are partially true, and that the question of exactly how much the Arctic convoys mattered is ultimately unanswerable, with the precision that some historians have claimed. What is not unanswerable is the question of whether the men who sailed the convoys believed they were doing something that mattered. The oral histories and written memoirs of Arctic convoy veterans are consistent on this point in a way that cuts through the strategic debate with blunt simplicity. They believed they were keeping the Soviet Union in the war. They believed that keeping the Soviet Union in the war was keeping Germany from winning. They believed that Germany winning was something worth dying to prevent. These beliefs were correct in their broad outline, and the men who held them did not require a detailed strategic analysis to hold them. They had the simpler and more immediate version of the same truth that the strategists in London and Washington had access to, in more elaborate form. The cargoes they carried were weapons that were going to be used against the Germans. That was enough. The exact percentage of Soviet military output represented by Allied supplies was not a calculation they needed to make, and they did not make it. They sailed. And across 78 convoys, 5.5 million tons of cargo, and the lives of hundreds of men on both sides of the water, that sailing was one of the things that held the Allied war effort together, from the cold winter of 1941 to the final spring of 1945. Chapter 16. The Human Cost Names, Ships, and the Arithmetic of Loss. There is a tendency, in the history of large military operations, for the specific to disappear into the aggregate, for the names and the faces to dissolve into the numbers, and for the numbers to become so large that they lose the power to mean anything beyond themselves. 35 ships became 11. 153 men died. 430 tanks went to the bottom. These are accurate figures, and they convey the scale of what happened to Convoy PQ-17. But scale, by itself, is not understanding. Understanding requires the specific, the particular ship, the particular man, to the particular morning on a particular sea, and the specific requires the kind of attention that moves against the grain of summary and resists the temptation to let the aggregate speak for what only the individual can adequately represent. This chapter is an attempt to hold both the aggregate and the specific in the same frame, to let the numbers retain their weight while recovering some of the particular texture of what those numbers actually contained. The Liberty ship, SS Daniel Morgan, was an American freighter, 441 feet in length, launched in 1942 and assigned to PQ-17 almost immediately after entering service. She was sunk by Heinkel, He-111 torpedo aircraft on the 5th of July, 1942, roughly 2 days after the scatter order had sent her steaming independently toward Arkhangelsk. Her crew survived. The ship sank in the Barents Sea in water several thousand feet deep, carrying a cargo that included Sherman tanks and general military supplies. The Daniel Morgan was one of hundreds of Liberty ships produced in American yards during the war, standardized, functional, and deliberately designed to be built faster than they could be sunk. She was also a specific workplace, a specific community of men who had sailed together for the weeks of the convoy, and a specific loss whose consequences fell on specific families in specific American towns that the official records of her sinking do not name. The aggregate loss of 24 ships contains 24 versions of that specificity, none of them identical. The SS Paulus Potter was a Dutch merchant vessel, one of several non-British, non-American ships in the convoy, a reminder that the Allies' war at sea was genuinely international in its human composition, even when it is remembered primarily in British and American terms. Dutch merchant sailors in 1942 were sailing for a country that had been occupied by Germany since May of 1940. Their ships flew the Dutch flag, but their home ports were in enemy hands. The families they had left behind were living under German occupation. The simple fact of their continued sailing of maintaining a merchant navy for a country that temporarily had no coast of its own to sail from was an act of collective continuity whose weight is easy to underestimate from the outside. Paulus Potter was sunk on the 5th of July, 1942. Her survivors, like the survivors of the other scattered ships, made their way to Novaya Zemlya and eventually to Soviet ports. They arrived in a country whose language they did not speak, whose systems they did not understand, and which would repatriate them through a process of Allied bureaucracy that took weeks or months. They had sailed for a country under occupation. They arrived in a Soviet port carrying almost nothing. They were alive. The armed merchant vessel Tsar Faran, one of the 3 rescue ships assigned to PQ-17, was sunk by German aircraft on the 5th of July, becoming, in the specific logic of her role, a ship that required the rescue that she existed to provide. Her survivors were taken aboard Zamalek, which continued its rescue work with its increased complement of survivors from 2 sinkings now crowding its accommodation. The rescue ship crews occupy a particular moral position in the story of PQ-17. Because their function was entirely reactive, they could not shoot down the aircraft, they could not chase the submarines, they could not change the orders that had scattered the convoy. They could only be present and move toward people in the water and pull them out of it. This is a simpler and less celebrated kind of service than combat, but it required its own form of courage, the courage of deliberate exposure, of stopping in water where submarines might still be hunting, of making your ship a visible and stationary target in the service of pulling another man over your side. Zafaran's crew had that courage and paid the price for it. Zamalek's crew had it and survived. The armed guard sailors of the United States Navy who were stationed aboard the merchant ships of PQ-17 occupied a position that their branch of service's own history has sometimes neglected. The armed guard was a wartime creation naval personnel assigned to merchant ships to man the defensive armament that civilian merchant sailors were not trained or required to operate. They were naval ratings in all formal respects: uniform, pay, discipline, and the legal status of combatants under the laws of war. But they lived and worked alongside merchant crews whose culture was fundamentally different from the naval culture, more informal, less hierarchical, built around a different relationship between individual skill and collective structure. The armed guard sailors who went down with PQ-17's ships, or who survived in lifeboats alongside their merchant shipmates, did not have the institutional backstory of the Royal Navy or the merchant service. They had been civilians months earlier in many cases, inducted into the Navy, trained on weapons systems, and placed aboard ships that the Navy did not own and could not control. Their courage under those conditions is not diminished by the fact that they were essentially improvised warriors. It is, if anything, made more remarkable by the brevity of the preparation that preceded it. The Soviet merchant sailors who crewed the several Soviet-flagged vessels in the convoy, including the tanker Azerbaijan, whose mostly female crew fought a fire and saved their ship, represented a category of participant whose story has been the least well told in Western accounts of PQ-17, for reasons that have more to do with the political history of the Cold War than with the historical significance of their contribution. Soviet merchant sailors in 1942 were operating within a political and institutional framework entirely different from their Western counterparts, a framework in which individual failure had consequences that went beyond professional accountability, in which political reliability was assessed alongside seamanship, and in which the concept of voluntary service had an entirely different meaning than it did in democratic countries. The women aboard Azerbaijan were not there because civilian women were assigned to dangerous Arctic voyages as a matter of normal practice. They were there because the Soviet war economy in 1942 was consuming men faster than it was producing them, and because the ships had to sail whether or not there were enough men available to crew them. Their survival of the fire and their delivery of their cargo was a genuine achievement, and it was used by Soviet propaganda immediately and extensively. That use does not diminish the achievement. The ship burned and kept going. That is a fact independent of how it was subsequently employed. The officers of the Royal Navy who commanded the escort vessels, the destroyers and corvettes and trawlers that had protected PQ-17 up to the moment of the scatter order, carried a specific and difficult weight in the plain. Aftermath. They had done their jobs effectively. The convoy had been successfully defended against the initial air attacks on the 4th of July. The formation had held. The losses before the scatter order were 2 ships, a serious but manageable result given the scale of the attacks that had been mounted. And then the order had come, and they had executed it, and the convoy they had protected had been destroyed in the days that followed. The emotional and professional weight of having been ordered to leave, of having obeyed, and of having known in the moment of obedience what the consequences would be, This is a weight that the escort officers' memoirs and oral histories describe with the specific flatness of people who have integrated an intolerable experience into the ongoing fact of their existence. They did not abandon the merchant ships by choice. They did not have a choice. That fact, while true, did not make it easier to live with. The merchant sailors who returned to sea after PQ-17, and there were many, made a decision whose internal logic is best understood by those who have spent their working lives at sea and understand what the sea means to people for whom it is not an adventure but a profession. The sea, for these men, was where their skill resided. It was what they knew how to do. The alternative to sailing was not safety in a country at war. There was no guaranteed safety anywhere, and the bombing of British port cities in the Blitz had demonstrated that remaining on shore was not an obviously safer choice than going back to sea. And there was the straightforward fact that the supply line to the Soviet Union still needed to be maintained, and that someone had to crew the ships that would carry it. The merchant sailors who went back were not reckless about the risk. The ones who came back from PQ-17 and described their experiences made clear that they were under no illusions about what the Arctic route entailed. They went back because they had the skill to be useful, because there was work to be done, and because the alternative, letting someone else carry the weight while they remained ashore, was not, for most of them, psychologically possible. The names of the ships are, in the end, the most concrete form in which the specific is preserved when the people themselves are gone. SS Washington, SS Daniel Morgan, SS John Witherspoon, SS Pan Atlantic, SS Alcoa Ranger, SS Olapana, SS Fairfield City, SS Carlton, SS Hartlebury, MV Aldersdale, SS El Capitan, SS Pancraft, SS Bolton Castle. Each name on this list is a specific population of men with specific histories, specific skills, specific fears, and specific last moments in the Arctic summer light. The aggregate of 24 names represents 24 versions of the same irreversibility, a hull that was a working ship in the morning and is a wreck on the seabed before the next morning arrives. The families of the men who did not come back from those ships carry the names differently, not as a list, but as a single name, the only one that matters to them, the one that appears in the telegram and on the memorial and in the space that someone used to occupy at a table, on an ordinary evening, in an ordinary house that was never quite ordinary again after the news arrived. The arithmetic of loss in Convoy PQ-17 cannot be made whole by any amount of strategic context or institutional analysis. It can be understood, placed in its historical frame, connected to its causes and its consequences, and remembered with the specificity it deserves. What it cannot be is justified by its outcomes or proportion to the larger suffering of the war. The 153 merchant sailors who died in the Barents Sea in July of 1942 did not die so that an institutional lesson could be learned. They died because a decision was made under uncertainty that turned out to be wrong. The lesson that was learned imperfectly, partially, but genuinely was extracted from their deaths by the people who survived them and the historians who came after. That is not the same as those deaths having a meaning. The meaning is in the living, not in the dying. And the living that came after the rebuilt convoys, the improved escorts, the supplies that reached the Soviet Union through the remainder of the war was built in part on the knowledge of what had been sacrificed to teach the lesson that PQ-17 represents. Chapter 17. The Eastern Front Connection. What reached Russia and what did not. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was the largest and most destructive theatre of military operations in human history, a front that stretched at its maximum extent for more than 3,000 kilometers, across which approximately 30 million soldiers engaged in 4 years of fighting that produced casualties on a scale that still strains comprehension. In this context, the question of what the Arctic convoys contributed to the Soviet war effort is not an abstract strategic question, but a question about the material conditions of specific battles fought at specific times by specific soldiers who had, or did not have, the weapons and equipment and fuel and food that the convoys were intended to deliver. The connection between a merchant ship loading tanks in an American port and a Soviet soldier driving one of those tanks at Kursk in the summer of 1943 is long, complicated, and verifiable. Each link in the chain is traceable, even if the aggregate is more than the sum of its traceable links. The Soviet military's assessment of Lend-Lease supplies, including those delivered through the Arctic route, was systematically minimized in official Soviet communications during and after the war, for reasons that were primarily political rather than empirical. Stalin was committed to the narrative that the Soviet Union had won the war through its own resources and the blood of its people, and that the Western Allies' contribution had been marginal. This narrative served internal political purposes. It maintained the primacy of the Communist Party's leadership claim, based on its direction of the war effort, and it served Cold War purposes after the conflict ended, by denying the Western Allies any claim to credit for the Soviet victory that might translate into diplomatic leverage. The official Soviet minimization of Lend-Lease was a deliberate political act, and the evidence now available from Soviet archives opened in the post-Soviet period does not support it. The private assessments of Soviet military commanders, expressed in documents not intended for public consumption, were considerably more frank about the importance of Allied supplies than the official narrative allowed. One of the most specific and direct connections between the Arctic convoy deliveries and the tactical conduct of the Eastern Front involves the truck supply. American trucks, particularly the Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton truck, which was delivered to the Soviet Union in large numbers through all three supply routes, became the primary motorized transport vehicle of the Red Army's offensive operations from 1943 onward. Soviet military historians writing in the post-Soviet period have acknowledged that the logistical underpinning of Operation Uranus, the counter-offensive that encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, depended to a significant degree on American-supplied trucks for the movement of supplies and reinforcements that the operation required. The trucks delivered through the Arctic convoys in 1941 and 1942 were among the earliest and most urgently needed of these deliveries. The 3,350 vehicles lost with PQ-17 represented a significant fraction of the total vehicle deliveries of that period, and their loss was felt in the logistics capacity available to the Soviet forces fighting at Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. The aviation supply connection between the Arctic convoys and the Eastern Front air war is similarly specific and traceable. By the spring of 1943, roughly 15 to 20% of the Soviet Air Force's frontline fighter strength consisted of American and British aircraft delivered through Lend-Lease, primarily the Bell P-39 Airacobra, which Soviet pilots, despite the aircraft's mixed reputation in Western service, found well suited to the low-altitude combat environment of the Eastern Front. These aircraft were delivered partly through the Pacific route and partly through the Arctic. The 210 aircraft lost with PQ-17 were a subset of the total delivery that was eventually completed by subsequent convoys. The reconstitution of the delivery schedule, after the 3-month Arctic suspension, meant that the Soviet Air Force received its quota later than planned, with consequences for specific units at specific points in the summer and autumn of 1942 that are documented in Soviet Air Force records but have not been fully integrated into the English-language historical literature. The food supply dimension of the Arctic deliveries is perhaps the least discussed in military histories, which naturally focus on weapons, but it may be the most humanly significant. The Soviet Union in 1942 was experiencing food shortages of a severity that amounted, in some regions and among some populations, to organized starvation. The collectivization disasters of the 1930s, the destruction of agricultural regions by the German advance, and the diversion of available food to military priorities combined to create a civilian food situation of extreme precariousness in the occupied and border regions, and a military food situation that was better than the civilian one, primarily because the state prioritized soldiers over civilians when allocating what was available. American food deliveries through Lend-Lease canned meat, fats, flour, sugar went partly to military rations and partly to civilian emergency allocations. The quantities involved were not sufficient to resolve the Soviet food crisis, but they provided a supplement to Soviet domestic production that, at specific moments of maximum shortage, prevented deterioration from serious to catastrophic for specific populations. This is not easily expressed as a strategic variable. It is a human variable, a fact about whether people ate or did not eat, and it belongs in any honest account of what the Arctic convoys carried and what happened to the men who carried it. The raw materials component of the convoy, cargoes, aluminium, copper, steel alloys, rubber, fed directly into Soviet industrial production rather than into military use on the front line. The Soviet industrial displacement to the Ural Mountains that had occurred in the winter of 1941–42 had saved the productive capacity of the Soviet war economy but had created severe supply chain disruptions as factories that had been rebuilt from scratch in remote locations awaited the raw materials to resume production. The aluminium delivered through the Arctic convoys went into Soviet aircraft production. The copper went into electrical systems for weapons and vehicles. The rubber, for which the Soviet Union had no domestic source and no adequate synthetic substitute in the early years of the war, went into tire production for the very trucks that were keeping the Red Army supplied. These supply connections are unglamorous in the way that industrial logistics is always unglamorous. But the weapons and vehicles that the convoys carried were only as useful as the factory capacity that could maintain and replace them, and that factory capacity was partly dependent on the raw materials that the convoys also carried. The 3-month suspension of Arctic convoys that followed PQ-17 has been assessed by some historians as having had minimal strategic consequence. The Persian corridor and Pacific route continued to deliver. Supplies and the Soviet military situation stabilized at Stalingrad through Soviet domestic resources rather than through Allied deliveries. This assessment is defensible at the aggregate level, but at the specific level, in the particular units that were short of specific equipment at specific moments during those 3 months, the suspension had consequences that the aggregate cannot fully absorb. The Soviet military's operational planning for the autumn and winter of 1942 was constrained by supply calculations that explicitly noted the absence of expected Arctic convoy deliveries. The operations that were planned around what was available rather than what had been scheduled to arrive. The operations that were not mounted, the offensives that were not launched because the material for them was not ready, cannot be listed because they did not happen. Their non-occurrence does not mean they had no cost. It means the cost was paid in time rather than in blood in months of German occupation of Soviet territory that continued while the necessary supply margin was being accumulated by slower routes. The soldiers of the Red Army who received Lend-Lease equipment, whether from the Arctic route or from the Persian corridor or the Pacific, did not, in the vast majority of cases, know where it had come from or what it had cost to deliver it. They knew the equipment by its characteristics, the Studebaker truck that was faster and more reliable than the domestic alternatives, the field telephone wire that was better insulated than Soviet production could manage, the canned pork that appeared in military rations under a Soviet label that had replaced the American one but fooled nobody. The knowledge that these things had crossed the Atlantic and the Arctic to reach them existed at the command level. At the soldier level, the material arrived and was used, and the question of its origin was less pressing than the question of whether it worked. It worked. The Arctic convoys worked. The cost at which they worked was extraordinary and is not adequately captured by any simple accounting, but the result that the Soviet Union remained supplied, remained fighting, and eventually reversed. The German advance is part of the Arctic convoy story, even when it is told in the voices of men who never saw the Barents Sea and never knew the names of the ships that had carried what sustained them. Chapter 18. Legacy and Memory. What PQ-17 teaches the world. It left behind. Every story that is told about the past is, in some sense, also told about the present, told to the people living now, in the hope that the past will illuminate something about the world they currently inhabit. The story of Convoy PQ-17 is not an exception to this. It has been told and retold in different registers and for different purposes across the 80 years since the summer of 1942, as a story about courage, about failure, about the politics of alliance, about the ethics of command, about the treatment of the merchant sailor, about the intelligence process, and about the fundamental difficulty of making correct decisions under conditions of irreducible uncertainty. Each of these tellings contains something true, none of them contains everything. The task of this final chapter is to hold as many of those true things in the same frame as possible, and to ask what the complete story held together in its full complexity says to a world that is not at war in the same way that 1942 was at war, but that continues to face versions of the same essential problems. The command failure at the heart of PQ-17 is not, at its root, a story about one admiral and one order. It is a story about the institutional architecture of decision-making under uncertainty, about how organizations structure the flow of information toward decision-makers, how they train those decision-makers to respond to incomplete information, and how they manage the pressure that creates the impulse to act decisively even when the most defensible action is to wait. The Royal Navy in 1942 had not explicitly addressed any of these questions in its training and institutional culture, because addressing them would have required the kind of organizational self-examination that institutions at war rarely have the luxury of conducting. The result was a culture that produced an officer pound who was professionally incapable of acknowledging uncertainty publicly and institutionally incapable of waiting when action was available, and who issued an order from that culture that cost 24 ships and 153 lives. The culture, not the man, is the primary lesson. The man was the instrument of the culture. The intelligence dimension of PQ-17 speaks directly to a problem that has not disappeared from the world of the 21st century, the problem of how intelligence assessments are communicated between analysts, decision-makers, and how the inherent uncertainty of intelligence conclusions is translated or mistranslated into the binary language of policy and command. Norman Denning provided a careful, qualified assessment that was technically accurate. Pound received it as insufficient and acted on the worst-case interpretation of what the uncertainty contained. The gap between Denning's assessment and Pound's reception of it was not a failure of honesty or competence on either side. It was a structural gap created by the different epistemic environments in which an intelligence, analyst, and a commander operate. The analyst's job is to describe what is known and what is uncertain. The commander's job is to decide, which requires choosing between options rather than describing a probability distribution. This structural gap between the language of intelligence and the language of decision continues to produce catastrophic mistranslations in contexts that are remote from the Barents Sea, but share. Prepared using Claude Sonnet 4.6. Thinking. Continue. Continuing directly from where Chapter 18 was cut off, picking up at but share. But share its essential architecture. The lesson is not that intelligence should be more certain before it is communicated upward. Intelligence cannot be made more certain by institutional pressure. The lesson is that decision-making cultures need to develop a functional literacy in uncertainty, a capacity to act on probabilistic assessments without requiring those assessments to be falsely converted into certainties that the evidence does not support. PQ-17 is one of the clearest demonstrations in modern military history of what happens when that literacy is absent, and it remains one of the most teachable cases in the curriculum of any serious study of intelligence and command. The treatment of the merchant sailor is a legacy thread from PQ-17 that runs into living memory and carries a particular moral weight. The men who crewed the merchant ships of the Arctic convoys and of the Atlantic convoys, and the Mediterranean convoys, and every other supply line of the Second World War were treated, for the duration of the conflict and for many decades afterward, as a category of participant whose contribution was acknowledged in general terms while being neglected in specific ones. They received no campaign medals for most of their service until 1995. Their widows received less adequate compensation than the widows of naval personnel. The institutional recognition that military service commands in the culture of commemoration, the parades, the specific memorials, the named registers of the fallen came late to the merchant sailor and came incompletely. The Arctic Star, when it finally arrived, was a genuine and meaningful acknowledgement, but it arrived after thousands of the men who deserved to receive it had already died without it. The lateness of the recognition is part of the record, and acknowledging it honestly is the minimum that the record requires. The specific memorials to Convoy PQ-17 that exist in the physical world are scattered across multiple countries in a way that reflects the internationalism of the disaster itself. In Britain, the Tower Hill Memorial in London carries the names of merchant sailors lost at sea during both World Wars, including those of PQ-17, on panels that most visitors to London pass without reading. In the United States, the American Merchant Marine Memorial in Washington carries a comparable record. In Russia, the city of Arkhangelsk, which received the survivors of the convoy and which remains a living community with direct historical connection to the Arctic convoys, maintains its own memorial to the Allied sailors who sailed to its port. In Norway, which was occupied by the Germans throughout the period of the convoys and whose people watched from the shore as both the hunters and the hunted passed their coast, there are memorials that acknowledge the role of the Norwegian-occupied coastline in the story of the Arctic convoys. These multiple and geographically dispersed memorials reflect the reality that PQ-17 belongs to no single nation. It is a shared story, written in the shared losses of men from at least a dozen countries who sailed together into waters that did not distinguish between their nationalities when dealing out its consequences. The physical remains of PQ-17 still exist, in the most literal sense, at the bottom of the Barents Sea. The wrecks of the sunken ships lie in water between several hundred and several thousand meters deep, most of them in positions that have been approximately known since the sinkings, but only in recent decades confirmed by systematic survey work. In 2015, a Russian oceanographic survey team located 3 of the sunken ships near the Norwegian-Russian maritime boundary, the first confirmed findings from the convoy that had been positively identified by direct investigation rather than by historical estimate. The tanks and vehicles and aircraft and ammunition that went to the bottom with those ships remain there, not deteriorated to nothing, because the cold and pressure of the deep Arctic Sea preserve metal differently from the shallow, warmer waters of other maritime environments. In the holds and on the decks of those wrecks, the physical material of the Second World War persists in the dark and the cold, 300 meters and more below the surface of a sea that most people will never see. The men who loaded those cargoes and the men who died trying to deliver them are long gone. The cargoes, in some form, remain. The relevance of PQ-17 to the study of coalition warfare conducted by an alliance of nations with different interests, different institutional cultures, and different strategic priorities is direct and contemporary. The Anglo-American friction produced by the disaster, the Anglo-Soviet tension that Churchill had to manage personally in Moscow in August of 1942, and the fundamental problem of operating a joint naval command in which the decision-maker and the affected parties had different information, different risk tolerances, and different conceptions of their obligations to each other. These are not historical curiosities. Coalition warfare continues to be the primary mode of large-scale military operations for the liberal democracies, and the structural problems of coalition command that PQ-17 illustrates have not been solved by the passage of time. They have been managed better in some contexts and worse in others, with outcomes that reflect the quality of the management more than any fundamental change in the underlying difficulties. Students of coalition warfare read PQ-17 not as history but as a case study with direct professional relevance, and the reading continues to produce insights that the students find applicable to the organizations they inhabit. The question of how to balance risk against obligation, the fundamental command dilemma that Pound faced on the evening of the 4th of July, recurs in every generation of military and political leadership, and it recurs in civilian context too. The decision-maker who has responsibility for both the assets that must be risked and the mission that requires risking them, operating under time pressure with incomplete information, choosing between a cautious option that might be too cautious and an aggressive option that might be too aggressive. This is not a problem that belongs exclusively to 1942 or to the Royal Navy. It belongs to anyone who has ever had to decide under conditions where the cost of being wrong falls on people other than themselves. The admiral who ordered the scatter was not risking his own life. He was risking the lives of the men in the merchant ships. The distance between the decision-maker and the people who bear the consequences of the decision is a structural feature of command. And PQ-17 illustrates its moral weight with particular force because the decision was wrong and the consequences were immediate, specific, and fatal. The role of historical memory in shaping how nations understand themselves and their obligations is something that the story of PQ-17 illuminates from an unexpected angle. Britain's long reluctance to fully and publicly acknowledge the command failure at the heart of the disaster, the decades of classified reports, the carefully managed public narrative, the delayed recognition of the merchant sailors reflects a tension that is not unique to Britain, but is perhaps especially visible in the British case, between the national need for a coherent and positive story about the war and the historical record's insistence on a more complicated truth. That tension has not been resolved, and it cannot be resolved because the needs it reflects are genuine on both sides. Nations do need stories about their past that can sustain public values and collective identity. And the historical record does insist on complexity and honesty. The best that can be done is to hold both things simultaneously, to tell the story of the courage and the failure together, without letting the courage excuse the failure or the failure diminish the courage. That is what this documentary has attempted to do across these 18 chapters, and it is the only mode of historical engagement that the people who were there, the men in the lifeboats, and the men behind the desks, are owed. The story of Convoy PQ-17 does not end with the last ship sunk on the 10th of July, 1942. It does not end with the armistice in May of 1945, or with the declassification of the Admiralty's records in the 1970s, or with the establishment of the Arctic Star in 1995. It ends if it ends with the last person who remembers it from inside, and that last person is now gone, because the youngest man who sailed on PQ-17 would be well over 100 years old today, and the last Arctic convoy veterans have passed within the lifetimes of the people listening to this. The story has crossed the threshold from living memory to historical memory, from something that people carry in their bodies and their nightmares to something that must be actively maintained, actively taught, and actively told if it is to continue to exist in the consciousness of the world that those men sailed through and died in and survived. This telling, this long, slow, careful reconstruction of what happened and why and what it cost, is one way of maintaining that memory. It is not the only way, but it is a way that honors the specificity of what those men endured, and specificity is what the dead are owed by the living who outlasted them. If you have reached these final words of this documentary, you have spent hours in the company of 35 ships and the men who sailed them through the worst waters in the world in the summer of 1942. You have heard the story of a command failure, of a ghost ship that destroyed a convoy without firing a shot, of men in lifeboats who navigated by sail and oar through 10 days of Arctic summer and reached the Soviet coast alive, of a junior officer who led 4 ships into the ice and painted them white, and disappeared from the war until the hunters had moved on. You have heard the story of 153 men who did not come back, and of a world that took 50 years to say their names properly. You know this story now. That knowing is not nothing. It is, in some small but real sense, the thing that those men were sailing toward when they left Iceland on the 27th of June, 1942, not toward death, not toward the scatter order, not toward the Barents Sea seabed, but toward the possibility that the world they were protecting would eventually understand, with full and clear eyes, what protecting it had cost. Share this story. Return to it. And if you found it worthy of the men it describes, leave a comment below, subscribe to this channel, and carry it forward into the next conversation where someone has never heard the name PQ-17. That is how these men stay alive. That is how this story earns the keeping.